then you are not bringing restorative justice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Booker, you proposed a new bill, the First Step Act, that would cut mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses and ban racial and religious profiling. However, when you ran for mayor in 2002, you supported the broken windows theory, one which resulted in police officers enforcing the laws regarding even minor infractions, such as loitering, panhandling, and littering. Do you now believe that contributed to the problems the First Step Act is trying to fix?
So first of all, that's patently not true. And these reports that get out there, it's just not true. When I ran for mayor in 2002, you can literally watch the movie. There was an Oscar-nominated documentary about my first run for mayor called Street Fight. I say Oscar-nominated, I have to tell you the truth. It lost in the Oscars to a movie called March of the Penguins, for crying out loud. You will see what I stood for. Never in any of the speeches you'll see in that did I talk about broken windows. I am the only person in the United States Senate that lives in a low-income black and brown community below the poverty line for 20 years. My faith, my Christian faith, Matthew 25, Jesus Christ was with poor people, with low-income folks, and I live in a community where we don't mistake wealth with worth. I lived for about a decade in public housing projects. In my community, we have shootings. In my community, we have slumlords that we've taken down. I'm the only person in this race that may be able to tell stories about being disproportionately pulled over, having yourself surrounded by police officers, guns drawn, followed in department stores. It has been a life purpose of me to change this criminal justice system that disproportionately targets young black men like I used to be before I got old and bald. My career will continue to be about fighting for those people that do not have a voice. The legislation I propose about keeping police departments accountable. Even as mayor, as I learned that as a black mayor in a black city, we still had problems within our police department, we joined with the ACLU to put national standard-setting accountability measures in place. And for folks who don't understand what this means, just look at the disproportionate number of unarmed African Americans being killed. We have a crisis in this country when parents like mine have to sit their black sons down and tell them, when you're going to go out and drive a car, literally rules for the road, not for just dealing with other drivers, but dealing with when police officers pull you over. This is a national crisis, and remember, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so my record as a guy who's the first in New Jersey, drug courts, youth courts, the first in New Jersey that did veterans courts, the first in New Jersey that did an office of reentry in a city hall, the first in New Jersey that did the accountability measures we put in place for police, the person who put in the first major Marijuana Justice Act in the United States Senate, the person who wrote and helped pass the only major criminal justice reform bill that reversed these kind of crazy mandatory minimums since in my lifetime, the person you can trust as president of the United States, not because of what they say they're gonna do, but because of what they've done, is me.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You introduced Senate legislation to create a commission to study the area of reparations. Is that just a way to push the issue past the election so it doesn't negatively affect voter support? And what kind of specifically race-conscious legislation would you favor to balance the economic scales?
I really appreciate that. You know, when the GI Bill or Social Security bills were written, they were written consciously to try to do things to exclude African Americans. Literally, for Social Security, they excluded entire professions that African Americans were disproportionately represented in. Domestic workers, which my great-grandmother was in this city. Agricultural workers were excluded because they were disproportionately African American. And so that's the tough thing. If the thing that created this problem were race-conscious policies to discriminate against African Americans, you need to design policies that understand that we have to address this gap. This isn't a black issue, this is an American issue. And so I, again, have designed policies since I've been in office to consciously affect them. You want to know one? It's a great example. people don't think about? When I got to the United States Senate, it was the least diverse place I had ever seen. I mean, I went to the Judiciary Committee and just looked around at the staffers, and I couldn't find a black person on the Judiciary Committee. Here is one of the most powerful committees on in our nation, making policy about criminal justice that disproportionately affects African Americans. And so for me, these issues, race-conscious issues, are not things I talk about, they're things I do. You know what I did? I pulled in a wingman, a guy named Brian Schatz, the senator from Hawaii, and we went to Chuck Schumer and said, you know what, I was a manager, I ran a city. People don't care about things unless they're measured and held accountable for them. And so you know what I asked Chuck Schumer to do? Make every Democratic senator have to report the diversity on their staff. And guess what happened when these senators who are elected by minority populations, guess what's happened to the number of African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and women, because it was very much no diversity of men and women in the Senate. Guess what's happened now? The rates of those employments have gone better. And you know what? When you have more diverse people at the table, they make better policy. And so this issue, again, it should not have taken until 2013 for an African-American senator to come down to the Senate to call this stuff out. But I'm sorry, my parents taught me it's not enough to be the first African-American at the table. In this case, I was the fourth black person ever elected to the United States Senate. Your job is to make sure you're not the last one, to open up doors wider. Because this country is one of the most diverse on the planet Earth, but our weakness will always lie when women, African Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ Americans, when there's not diversity in every major element of our office. And I'm telling you, as African Americans, we must be concerned. As Latinos, we must be concerned. As Americans, we must be concerned. Because think about this, $60+ trillion under management, and women and minorities are managing the funds of about 1.3% of it. All the capital that's out there, the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in this country are black and Latino women, but they get a small share of the capital to expand their businesses. We are hurting ourselves by undermining those ideals of equality in every area of American life. And we need a president that just doesn't talk about what I'm going to do when I'm president, but has a long track record of creating more diversity in their contracting as a city leader, more diversity in the Senate itself. As President of the United States, I will make sure that we deal with the racial wealth gap, if we deal with the lack of diversity, that we deal with the racial harms that are still being made manifest today in our society.
Thank you. Senator Booker, at this time, we have an audience question from Joy Esposito, who is the Assistant Director of the Evelyn K. Davis Center for Working Families.
So forgive me for quoting Anita Baker, but you bring me joy.
Good morning. How are you? Senator Booker, the NAACP's 2017 report on charter schools cites studies that show charter schools are more racially and economically segregated than public schools in the same district. And charter schools have higher expulsion rates, particularly for black students. As mayor of Newark, you supported charter schools. Do you still support charter schools?
I support great schools. And let me just say, I know we are a party, but only 3% of American schools are charter schools. Whoever the next president is better make sure that they have a robust agenda to transform public education. And so I'm going to have that robust agenda. I'm going to make sure that we get a Secretary of Education that actually has taught in public schools. I'm going to make, you could applaud that, please. I'm going to make sure that we increase teacher salary. I'm going to make sure that we fully fund special education. I'm going to do all these things. And you know how you can trust me to do it? Because it's what I did in Newark. One of the first biggest strategies we did was to increase the salaries of public school teachers. We transformed our school system, 30% increase in graduation rates. We're actually now the #1 school system in America. Before it was under state takeover, one of the lowest performing urban districts in our state. Now it's the #1 school system in America for beat the odds schools, high poverty to go to college. And you know what? I did it by being loyal to my kids. And so there are states that have awful charter laws that I would be against. But you know what? In my city, charter schools were schools that provided for the genius of my children. We found local solutions that worked for us. We closed bad charter schools, but you know what? The ones that were working, we said to them to expand, but play by the same rules as our public schools. You can't cream, you can't have lower percentages of special needs kids. We actually joined together in a one enrollment system, brought our system closer together. And so you want to come after the charter schools that are educating low-income black and brown kids in my city, you're going to have to come through me. But I'll tell you this right now. As your president, I'm going to fight the kind of things I see in this state that are outrageous, going against teachers' right to collectively bargain for their full benefits and salaries. That is outrageous, unacceptable. Trying to privatize schools and drain them of their resources and their funding. I'm going to fight to make sure that this country, that every single one of your children, whether you're in a rural area or an urban area, wherever you are, I will be the education president. And I know also this, education does not start in kindergarten. We have a shameful record in this nation because we don't understand that 90% of brain development happens from the womb until the 5th year. How can we be the only industrial nation that does not have universal prenatal care? And as a result of that, we lead industrial nations in infant mortality, in maternal mortality, and black women have 4 times the rate of maternal mortality than white women. This is unacceptable that we don't have universal preschool, paid family leave, affordable child care. These are all education issues. And so as President of the United States, as somebody who actually took responsibility for transforming a school system for a black and brown community that was below the poverty line, that produced results that are the envy of the nation, as your president, I'm going to make sure we understand that education starts with having every woman have access to prenatal care and goes all the way until apprenticeship programs, college programs, and people get to careers. And that there even is in the nation where it's going to have a future where the workforce is transforming, where we see disappearances of tons of jobs. We must understand that there should be mid-career education for middle-aged families too. If you leave your job because it's been outsourced, or we'll fight against that, but because of technology, you should have mid-career training that gives you a stable income so that you can go on to the jobs of the future and be trained and educated for them as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Booker, at this time, I'll give you the opportunity for a 1-minute closing remark.
Sure, 1 minute real quick. I am a child of a black family that told me one thing. My father, when he watched me go to Yale, to Stanford to get my Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, he goes, "Boy, you got more degrees in the month of July, but you ain't hot." Life ain't about the degrees you get, it's about the service you give. You talked about me coming to where I am because of tenants, because of people who fought for my housing right. My first job was leaving Yale Law School, going into an inner city community that I still live in to fight for the housing rights of other people, because you can't pay blessings back, you gotta pay them forward. We are in a moment in America where we need a candidate that isn't about one wing of the Democratic Party or another, but that can unite the entire Democratic Party, because we have one shot to make Donald Trump a one-term president. And it's not enough to just beat Donald Trump. Beating Donald Trump is a floor, it's not the ceiling. It gets us out of the valley, but it does not get us to the mountaintop. To get to the mountaintop, we got to do more than just create partisan majorities. We have to create new American majorities. We have to have a leader that inspires us to remember that the lines that divide us are nowhere near as strong as the ties that bind us. I am here because in my grandparents' generation, in my parents' generation of civil rights, women's rights, voting rights, that we called to the moral imagination of this nation and fought to put more indivisible into this one nation under God. I will be that kind of inspiring leader. I will bring this country together. Please, here in Iowa, if you believe in me, believe in my heart, believe in my spirit, caucus for me. Go to CoryBooker.com. Join the great American movement that we need today and we will have tomorrow when I'm your president. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we'd like to welcome to the stage Senator Amy Klobuchar. Maybe not at this time. At this time, no? She's coming. She's here, guys. I promise. Okay.
Quick mic check.
Mic check. Thank you, Heather.
We're matching.
Came through with the music. No, I think somebody, CLE just put it on for her. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Amy Klobuchar. Thank you, Senator. Pleasure to meet you.
Very good. Hi.
Good morning.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Sorry about that, a little delay out there. My friend Cory Booker, what a great guy, huh?
Right?
I want to, first, I heard a Keo's out there. Is that true?
So you're right.
Somewhere. Where is he? Okay. So I went with him to the farmer's market in Des Moines. Here I am, the presidential candidate, and the people were interested in this order. 1, a Keo, 2, his parrot, and then me. And so he has been a really, really good friend, and it's fun to be here with all of you. So my background, just so you know, a little different than Donald Trump's. I'm the granddaughter of an iron ore miner who worked 1,500 feet underground his whole life, and he saved money in a coffee can to send my dad to college. And my dad went to a 2-year college and then finished up at the University of Minnesota. My mom grew up in Milwaukee, and she wanted to be a teacher and came to Minnesota because they had strong teachers' unions, and she taught 2nd grade until she was 70 years old. So I stand before you today as the granddaughter of an iron ore miner and the daughter of a teacher and a newspaperman, as the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from the state of Minnesota and a candidate for President of the United States. And that is because we live in this country of shared dreams, that no matter where you come from or who you know, that you should be able to make it in America, which I think this forum today is really about. It's about systematic racism that has really held people back. And you know it exists when you've got an African-American woman that shows up in an emergency room in New Orleans, says her hands are swollen, no one does anything about it, and she loses her baby. And you know it exists when you have a vice president of a company in my state who goes shopping at a store and gets followed around all the time by the store security. And you know it exists when you know those numbers, that an African-American woman makes 61 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. All right? That's systematic racism. And that's why the solutions, there are many. And I think today we're focusing on the economic piece of it, which is incredibly important. That means everything from increasing the minimum wage to better child care, to making sure that retirement works for everyone. It is looking at those in-demand occupations where people can make a lot of money, and making sure that it's not just white people going into those jobs, and how we basically connect our African-American community and our students with those jobs, and so that they can succeed like everyone else. It is about the criminal justice system, and that's actually the second part of my resume after being born, was that I went to college and law school, and then I ended up at a law firm for a while. I had a lot of student loans, and then I ended up heading up the county attorney's office in Minnesota, where I confronted firsthand some of the racism that we've been talking about. It made me really devoted to working with the Innocence Project, to dealing with drug court, to making sure that we did a better job in how we handled cases, and to take on hate crimes. And I guess I'll end with that story and then take some questions here. But my first visit ever to the White House was when Bill Clinton was president. A lot of you guys were hardly born, but that's okay. And I was invited there because he was introducing the Matthew Shepard's hate crime bill and had a major focus on hate crime. And I had prosecuted a number of hate crimes, including the story of a guy that said he was going to go out and kill a black kid on Martin Luther King Day. And we ended up getting that guy. Luckily, the boy didn't die, but he was severely injured. That actually happened. So there I am at the White House. I've never even been there on a tour. And my job is to introduce the president when he introduces this hate crime bill. And it was the last minute they asked me to introduce him. And I'm standing outside of the East Room, and I've got the president on one side, he's super tall, right? And I've got Janet Reno, who was at the time the Attorney General, and Eric Holder, who was her deputy, on the other side. I'm holding my little notes, and the band starts playing that music, Hail to the Chief, you know, da, 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 da. And I start walking in, and all of a sudden I feel this big hand on my shoulder, and this voice goes, I know you're gonna do great out there, but when they play that song, I usually go first. That really happened to me. So that may have been my first visit to the White House, but it won't be my last. So thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Senator,
yes.
A former president from Minneapolis, NAACP, has criticized your handling of officer-involved shootings. The criticism is that instead of going forward with the prosecution yourself, you sent them to a grand jury. Mm-hmm. Is that a practice you believe that you should change, and do you believe you have anything to apologize for?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think that practice must change. When I was the DA, the county attorney, and this is back starting in 1998, that was really the practice, right? Every single jurisdiction in our state had those cases, the officer-involved shootings. They would go to a grand jury because the thought was, well, that's the best way to insulate the decision-making from some kind of politics. That's what the thought was. And as I've looked at it over the years, especially after we had in our state, long after I was a prosecutor, I was in the Senate at this point, the case of Philando Castile that many of you may have followed, a cafeteria worker loved by his family and friends that was just stopped in a car and basically had said, said to the officer, and you can hear it, that he had a concealed carry permit and he got shot and killed right there in that car. And I was at that funeral. I've met with his family. It was an outrageous situation. And since that time, a lot of the prosecutors in our state, with my urging and belief, have started taking those kinds of cases and making the decisions themselves so that they're more accountable to the community. And I think that is by far the best way to do it. But I think we go beyond that to some of these other more systemic issues in our system. I would look at sentencing. And we had sentencing guidelines in our state, which I think are a good thing. And I think we need to change those mandatory minimums that are a bad thing. And the guidelines at least give you the ability to have more flexibility in how you're going to do sentencing. I was a big believer in the First Step Act. I was a co-sponsor of that, which we just passed in Washington, one of the few bipartisan bills, and the fact that I am a former prosecutor, I think was really helpful. I am a big believer in going beyond that to the Second Step Act to encourage the states with incentives for the 90% of people who are incarcerated in state and local jails, that they do the same thing, and they start reducing the sentences for nonviolent offenders and getting people out that shouldn't be there in prison. The other thing that, to me, I got really involved in for those 8 years I had that job was with the Innocence Project on false IDs. And actually, some of this came out of some research in Iowa. And I was one of the first jurisdictions that did ID in a different way, that instead of showing all the pictures at once, showing a witness one picture at a time and asking them if that was the person or not. There's a few nodding of heads of good law students out there, because that actually reduces racially discriminatory bad IDs. I diversified our office. We reduced African American incarceration rates in prison during my 8 years by 12%. We made a much bigger focus on white collar and used drug courts. But to me, that is just the beginning. That's one office. But I think there's so much more that needs to be done nationally. And I also think we need to even get beyond the criminal justice issue to what happens when you get out of prison. I am a big believer in changing our laws, not just state by federally, to say that when someone has served their sentence, that they're out of prison, that they should be able to vote. And I think this is an outrageous, we are literally, you've got a situation where people have served their time and they are out in the community and we want them to participate in the community. And so that should mean, one, voting rights, but it also should mean things like banning the box. Maybe you've heard about this on applications, so that that is not the first thing that people are asked in a job interview about their criminal record. You know they're going to look and vet applicants, we know that. But if it's the first thing, we've seen time and time again studies showing that that makes them not even be allowed to go to the next interview, not even be able to make their case, and they basically don't get the interview at all. So I think that would be helpful. So I just see the criminal justice issue as not just about the system, which must be changed with body cameras and better use of hiring and what we do with grand juries. I think it goes the next step as well of when people have been in the system, what happens to them then? And we must make this more fair. This isn't just about criminal justice, it's also about our economy, because we want everyone to have a seat at the table, we want everyone participating, and the way you do that is have a criminal justice system that doesn't slam people for lives and doesn't make it impossible for them to participate in our country, in our democracy, and in our economy.
Thank you, Senator. So you've outlined how that you believe the process should change, but
Yeah.
do you feel that you should apologize for being a practitioner of this process?
Yeah, well, I think that, of course, I'm sorry that we had that process in place. That wasn't the right way to do it, and I'm glad that we've changed it, and I think that's a very important thing to acknowledge. I think that everyone has to come to grips with when they're part of a system that isn't right, and the key is not just that you realize it, like in a 12-step program, right? But the other piece about it is what do you do then? What do you do where you take your knowledge? And I think one of the things that would make me a unique president is that I would have had that experience, and I've shown over the last decade, especially in my time here in the Senate, that I'm able to take the experience that I've had in seeing that drug courts work and seeing that you don't want to see repeat customers in the criminal justice system. In taking that out and expanding it beyond just criminal justice reforms, which I'm a big believer in, but also expanding it out into economic and environmental justice reforms. Okay.
Good morning.
Hi.
There's a huge gap in retirement savings between Black families and their white counterparts. How do you ensure your retirement proposals can close that gap?
Sure. So one of the things we're seeing right now is that we're seeing more and more students and young people in the gig economy, right? Where you work not just one job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs. And actually, there's so many people that are doing that right now just to make ends meet. And I think that's wrong. So the first thing you want to do is stabilize that situation by increasing the minimum wage, by making childcare more affordable. And I have all these plans at amyklobuchar.com, including a way to pay for them. So that's the first thing you have to do. The second thing is look at retirement. We have to keep Social Security strong. I would make sure that it's there for you guys, because right now it's set to get reduced in its payments by 2034. And so that bill that actually Bernie leads, that I've been a long-time sponsor of, would bust the cap, basically. Right now, there's a cap at $133,000 in income where people stop paying into Social Security. So what you can do is create a donut hole between $133,000 and $250,000. And for people making over $250,000 a year, they're doing okay for themselves, right? Then they start paying in again to Social Security. That would keep it stable first. The second thing is to look at all of our retirement right now. I know for the students out there, it's not the first thing on your minds, but you got to start thinking about it, because you're going to get so screwed by this. if we just keep everything the way it is and don't do anything for you. Up savings account, something that I've introduced with Chris Coons, he's a senator from Delaware, that SEIU strongly supports. It says for people that aren't at places where you got 401ks or some kind of pension, that you are able to, for smaller employers, they put 50 cents an hour into an account for your retirement. You get to change it, you get to keep it when you go to other jobs. It goes up to $650,000 by the end, when the time you're ready to retire. It works for temporary jobs, and also you can take the first $2,500 out every year for emergency expenses. Why? Because over half of the people in our country don't even have $400 if they go to an emergency room. Thank you. So you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you. So I just want you guys, I know that you're not voting on retirement, okay? And I know what the focus is right now and should be. The younger generation, you guys, we cannot win on gun safety without you. That's what's changing things. We cannot win on climate change without young people. We cannot win on changing and making a college more affordable without you. But don't forget retirement, because someday you're going to be there. And we don't want to have all the money go to some people and none that's left for you. And so that's why we're so focused on this. Okay?
Senator, thank you. This next question was submitted by an audience member who perhaps got cold feet about asking it directly. So
It's okay. They can still stand up if they want.
why would your general election candidacy appeal to voters of color? What are you proposing that would do that? Can you energize the minority vote other than just being the anti-Trump candidate?
Okay. Thanks. By the way, it's kind of fun to be the anti-Trump candidate. That's okay. First of all, I have been someone that has reached out to everyone in my election. So I think track records matter. I think a lot of people say things right before an election to get votes, but you got to look at what they've really done in their lives. And for me, I am someone that has led my ticket every single time and been able to get people with me. Since I've led the ticket in Minnesota, we've had the highest voter turnout in the country, okay? In the country. We have brought people out like never before. We proudly elected our first African-American statewide official in Minnesota, my friend Keith Ellison, in the last election. I led that ticket and worked with him on that ticket. We have diversified our legislature, our city council. We have 2 African-American trans members of the Minneapolis City Council now last year, and we've just made tremendous strides. So I would talk to some of them, if I were you, about what I've done in terms of reaching out. In terms of energizing people, I think what energizes people is beating Donald Trump, but it's also understanding that the work that we have to do doesn't end on Election Day, it begins on Inauguration Day. And those are the things that you just heard Senator Booker talk about with these bills that I know we can get done as long as we don't just win, but we win big. It's everything from making sure that we get his bill done to invest in impoverished communities. It is my bill to end child poverty in 1 generation. And by the way, we can do this. This is an Academy of Science report. You can reduce it in half in 10 years and end it in a generation. We can make sure that our laws are changed and we reverse the discriminatory practices of this administration. They have done everything but try to reverse Barack Obama's work that he did to invest in early capital for African-American businesses with Minority Business Development Agency. He tries to reverse the work that had been done to stop discrimination in school discipline. You can literally go through everything. So I think quick action energizes people. It especially energizes young people. I know this because my daughter's 24. She doesn't want to hear about something that's happening 20 years from now, like retirement, but that's okay. So what this is, what I've got out there is a 100-day plan for over 100 things you can get done in the first 100 days. And these aren't just introducing bills, they are things you can actually do without Congress. Because right now we have a trust breakdown. We have a president that wakes up every morning that tries to divide people, that tries to do it. He goes after immigrants. He goes after people of color. He belittles people that don't agree with him. He makes mincemeat of our democracy. That's what he does every single day. He literally, after Charlottesville, says there's two sides, right? There's not two sides when the other side is the Ku Klux Klan. There's only one side, and that's the American side. So what I plan to do is to make the economic argument for change from this guy. I plan to bring people with me. I don't want to be the president for half of America. I want to be the president for all of America. And the last thing I'd say is that to energize people, I have been the leader in the US Senate on voting. And that means passing my bill to automatically register every kid to vote when they turn 18. Not to mess around with all this stuff. To pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Because what we have is discrimination run rampant when it comes to voting. If the Georgia election laws had been better, if they hadn't purged all those names, they hadn't done all that stuff they did, Stacey Abrams would be the governor of Georgia right now. So if you want to change and bring people with us, you've got to go to that fundamental issue of voting rights. And that will motivate, by the way, not just people of color who are the most hurt by it, but it's going to motivate everyone because no one thinks that you should be shutting people out from our democracy.
So you sort of mentioned that we should go to your website to hear about your child care plan, but we'd like you to talk about it a little bit, how you would pay for it. The average cost of child care is way beyond the means of many families, including African-American households in Iowa. What would you do to make it more affordable and also to ensure that child care workers are being paid a living wage?
Sure. Well, first of that is allowing unions to organize, which is key to a lot of what we need to do here if you're going to make sure that we respect the dignity of work. And that's why my education plan, which I know we're talking about child care, but it really focuses on connecting the jobs that we have and will need with our education system. We're going to have 78,000 job openings for electricians in the next few years. We're going to have nearly the same amount of job openings for plumbers. And I think what we should do is get those 1- and 2-year degrees free. But then I would double the Pell Grants, by the way, from 6,000 to 12,000. So the money goes to where people most need it, which includes students here at Drake, which includes students at historically black colleges. That's what I think that we should do, and so check that out. So how it relates to childcare is that I have such a focus on that dignity of work and making sure that we are putting our resources where we need it so people are able to pay for their families, that this is a big part of it. So what the proposal is, it's actually a bill in the Senate that Senator Patty Murray leads, and it takes 7% of your income, and it says you shouldn't have to pay more than 7% of your income for childcare. And if it goes anywhere above that, then the government will subsidize it. And it is paid for in my plan with the increasing the taxes on the top 2 brackets of the income tax. And just so you know, those brackets were at one place when Barack Obama was president, and good old Donald Trump reduced them again with that horrific tax bill, which gave you, students, over $1 trillion in debt on your shoulders, which allowed him to go down to Mar-a-Lago and say to his pals, this is a quote, "I just made you a lot richer." He wasn't helping people in this room when that money could go to child care. That's not what he's doing. So while he went down to Mar-a-Lago and said that, I cannot wait to be with him on the debate stage, because what I'm going to say to him is this. So, you think the heartland is flyover country? I live here. You know, you think you can treat our workers and our farmers like poker chips in one of your bankrupt casinos? That's what he does. They are my friends and my neighbors. And you go down to Mar-a-Lago and tell all your friends that they're going to get richer? Well, I can tell you where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to our neighborhoods, and I'm going to give them that gun safety legislation to make things safer. I'm going to go to our small towns and say, I get it that one size doesn't fit all. I'm going to go to our restaurant workers and our people that are making minimum wage and say, we're going to increase that minimum wage. And I'm going to go to all of you, where I am right now. I don't see Donald Trump here, and tell you right now that we must move forward on criminal justice reform and voting reform if we are going to ever get the kind of economic and environmental justice reform that we want. So.
Thank you, Senator. At this time, we'll offer you a 1-minute close.
Okay, you guys look like some kind of news desk back there. It's very impressive.
Just got off the news.
Yeah,
this
I
morning.
know, that's what you do. Okay, so I'll end really where I just ended, and that is this, is that our work does not end on Election Day. It starts on Inauguration Day. And you think about the march that we are on, that is the march. The march started the day after the inauguration, when millions of people, including here in this town, marched all over the country. They marched for justice. The day after that, 6,000 women signed up to run for office. That happened. On day nine, when that mean-spirited refugee order came out, people spontaneously showed up at airports on a Saturday night all over this country. They did that. Who does that on a Saturday night? People did that in America. On day 100, my favorite march, the March for Science, my favorite sign, what do we want science? When do we want it? After peer review. You go into the summer where people stood together and warded off that disastrous attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act and kick people off their health insurance. You go into the fall, these original legislative races where in Virginia and New Jersey and other places we elected this incredibly diverse group of new legislators. I was just helping one of those new legislators out in Virginia last weekend. But my favorite race was this guy in New Jersey, an incumbent who the day of the Women's March said, "I hope they'll be home in time to make dinner." That guy, that next fall, got defeated by an African-American woman. That's what happened. March with those students in Parkland, but they don't just march, they voted. And they talked to their dads and their grandpas from hunting families, and we changed history. That's the march we're on, and actually ended for that election in 2018 when you guys, Iowa, sent Abby and Cindy to the House of Representatives and turned it into the People's House again. And just one last thing I'll say. If people think a woman can't beat Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi does it every single day. All right? So, thank you. Thank you, and thank you, NAACP. Thank you, Drake, by the way, for giving me this incredible woman in Roxanne Conlon. Check her out. One of the first women to ever graduate from this law school. She also went to college here. One of 3 women in her law school class. She went on to become the U.S. Attorney and then also the head of the trial lawyers nationally, very famous in Iowa, and this weekend she endorsed me. So thank you, Drake. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Amy Klobuchar. At this time, we'd like to bring to the stage Representative John Delaney. Good to see you again. Good morning. Doing good.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hey, Representative. Nice to see you. Everyone having a nice morning? It's beautiful out there. Who was at the big dinner last night? All right. It was quite the show. I was really happy to be there. So, a few years ago, I was sitting in one of my committees, a committee called the Joint Economic Committee. And there was a report that the Joint Economic Committee issued, and it was titled The Condition or the Economic Conditions of African Americans in the United States of America. And I actually sat there and read through this whole report. I'm not sure anyone else actually did. And it had a lot of very troubling statistics in it, statistics that many of you are probably quite familiar with. The wealth gap, the income gap that exists in our various communities in the country. But there was one statistic that really got me. And it was the fact that if you were born in the bottom quartile economically in the United States of America, so if you were born in more of a struggling family in this country, the chances of you making it to the top quartile were 4 times greater if you were white than if you were African American. So in other words, or put another way, the chances of upward mobility for people in our country who came from struggling families to make it, to have financial success was just much greater based on the color of your skin. And this really hit me because I had been born in the bottom quartile economically. My dad was a construction worker. My parents didn't go to college. We struggled growing up. I got a great education, in part paid for by my dad's union. He was a member of a terrific union called the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I became an entrepreneur. I started 2 businesses. Fortunately, they were successful. I created thousands of jobs and then had the opportunity to run for Congress. And I'd always felt good about my success. But then I saw the statistic and I said, you know, it was just a lot easier for me. And it made me really zero in on what I think is one of the main missions for me in public service, which is to make sure every young person, regardless of the condition of their birth, the color of their skin, or the geography of their birth, which is increasingly a problem in this country, has the exact same opportunities. And that's a big part of my platform for Congress, for president. When I was running my last business, I got an award from the Obama administration for investing in disadvantaged communities. You know, because I saw tremendous opportunities in these communities. And so we need an agenda to ensure that everyone has opportunity in this country. And that agenda has to start with investing in communities and investing in people. If you look at how capital is flowing in this country, both private capital and public capital, it is clearly not getting invested fairly in all our communities. Last year in the United States of America, and I'll finish on this point, 80% of the investments in new businesses went to 50 counties in this country, out of 3,100 counties. I want you to think about that. 1.6% of the counties in the United States of America got 80% of the money for startup businesses. Yet 80% of our kids live in counties where the jobs that are getting created are not as good as the jobs that used to exist. That is not a country of opportunity. That is a country, my friends, of birthright, where you got to be born in the right city, go to the right school to have a shot in the United States of America. And that's not what this country should be all about. And as your president, I'm committed to reversing all of those trends. So I think we're going to get started now.
Thank you.
Did you call it Kale?
She's the second question.
Kale is the first one, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. So now we'll have an audience question for Representative Akeo Abdul Samad.
You got your Halloween colors on.
I got it.
Okay, you was cool until then. Thank you, Representative. My question is, independent African-American nonprofits that have boots on the ground have problems getting adequate funding to help with mental health, survivors of gun violence, job creation, and et cetera. What will you do to address this void of funding?
Well, first of all, Representative, I want to thank you for your leadership on so many areas, particularly the tragedy of gun violence in this country, which is one of the issues you're addressing there. So what I'm going to do is change these funding patterns. I mean, the issue you're raising, which is how money flows in this country, both private money and public money, is at the root cause of so much inequality in our nation. We have a huge issue with mental health in this country. I actually think the mental health situation in this country is clearly, by any measure, at crisis levels and is behind so many of the issues we have. And part of that is because there's a lack of parity between the physical health care system and the mental health care system. But part of it is how money flows. So whether you're talking about public education, which is one of the most inequitably funded institutions in our society because it's tied to property taxes, and if your property values are low, the property taxes are lower, you get less money for your public schools. It perpetuates inequality and communities of color are more likely to live in low property value communities. It's terribly racially unjust how we fund public education. The same is true with how we fund healthcare. The same is true with how we fund affordable housing. The same is true with so many of these issues. So we have to start getting fairness and equality in terms of how private capital and public capital flows. You're talking about public capital. I will make sure the kind of grant programs you're referring to around mental health and gun violence and helping survivors, those numbers get plussed up so that we start getting equality of outcomes in these communities. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative Delaney. You have discussed ensuring that minority entrepreneurs have equal access to capital. So the question is, what did you do in your business to ensure that African Americans had equal access to loans and at the same rates? And how would you translate this to federal policy?
Sure. So my second company was a company called Capital Source that focused on making loans to small to mid-sized businesses all over the United States of America. My company had several thousand employees, but we lent money to 5,000 small to mid-sized businesses all over the United States of America across the time I ran the business. And that was a part of the market that the big banks were ignoring, which is one of the reasons we were able to build a big, successful business. But I was focused on making sure every community was available for our products. And we actually found tremendous opportunities with minority-owned businesses and people trying to do business in inner cities in our country. And we focused on that, which is why the Obama administration gave us an award. And they give one of these a year. It was one of the things I was most proud of in my business career. It's called the Bank Enterprise Award. It's given to the financial institution in the United States that in their judgment, this is the Obama administration's Treasury Department, does the best job providing loans to disadvantaged communities in an ethical manner, which is what we did. You know, I was in Detroit this past summer around the debates, and I visited a group called the Entrepreneurs of Color, which is a group of entrepreneurs that are being backed by something called the Detroit Venture Fund, which is funded by the government, nonprofits, and the private sector to focus on minority businesses. It's the second time I met with the group. You know, the Detroit Venture Fund has backed 52 entrepreneurs of color, and 51 of them are still operating. That's a better track record than you see anywhere, which shows you if you just give people a little spark, they're going to make it happen. So what I'm going to do as president within the Small Business Administration, I'm going to set up 2 new programs. One to make investments, equity investments in minority-owned businesses, and the other to make debt investments in minority-owned businesses. These will be new charters that are issued by the SBA to create SBA-guaranteed programs that focus on that. I'm also going to push to require greater transparency. I'd like all the public companies to disclose their percentage of minority contractors, because that'll be a very valuable thing. Because a lot of companies like to brag about how good they are at contracting with minority-owned businesses, and good for them. But wouldn't it be good to know how all the public companies are doing on this, to make sure they all have inclusive business practices? That'll also create a spark, because it'll encourage people to make sure they're actually contracting with minority businesses. So a combination of creating opportunities by encouraging the right behavior, and then making sure there's programs so people can access capital, that's what's going to turn these communities around. We need more entrepreneurs in inner city communities, and by the way, we need more entrepreneurs in rural America.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative, you have talked about how 6.9% of Americans are unbanked, but 16.9% of African Americans are unbanked. What does this mean to you, and how do you plan to combat this issue?
So it's a huge problem, because unless you're connected to the banking system, right, it's actually hard for you to function successfully in society. And I have a proposal that's very unique to address this issue. And my proposal is to allow for the creation of nonprofit banks. And you got to bear with me on this. Our banking laws in the United States of America require all banks to be for-profit enterprises, other than credit unions, who serve only their members. So in some ways, they don't really get at this issue. So every bank's got to be for-profit by law. which means they got to actually make decisions about where they set up branches and where they put team members based on how much money those places are going to make them. Yet if you go to inner city America, you see all these amazing entrepreneurs and philanthropists who are doing things like microloans, who are doing things like financial literacy programs, who are doing things like affordable housing programs, but the people they're trying to help are actually not connected to the banking system. So it doesn't help if you got all these financial literacy programs and affordable housing programs and microloan programs when the person you're targeting has to go to a payday lender or a check cashing place. So what I've proposed is the government create nonprofit banks. You'd have to get a special charter, you'd have to show that where you're going to operate is a disadvantaged community, and you'd have to show that you have sustainable philanthropic support to justify the charter. But then we'd actually set up banks in the communities that need them. They would have the right mission, and they'd be able to actually provide the services that these communities need. And I believe that 16.9% number will go way down.
Thank you.
But again, these are real solutions to the specific problems that are facing these communities. They're not just talking points. They're actually, we got a problem. We got 16.9%, 0.6%. Okay, why does that problem exist? Because banks don't operate in these communities. Okay, why don't they do that? Because of this rule. So let's fix the rule, solve the problem, and make it happen.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Under your discussion of education disparity, you mentioned that you would like to expand programs that would that help low-income urban families achieve financial stability through education and job training. What is the federal government's role in achieving this?
So, the first thing I would like to do as part of my educational policy, and I think the federal government has a role, because through the Department of Education, we have the ability to put out carrots, and we have the ability to use sticks, right? Through grant programs, we can create matching programs, we can tie federal funding to certain things that school districts do. Fundamentally, a lot of decisions around public schools are made at the school district level. We all know that. That's not going to change. But the federal government, through a robust Department of Education, can create incentives to make sure we get the outcome that we need. I believe what we need in this country is pre-K through 14 as part of basic public education. Right now in the United States of America, K through 12 is part of basic public education. That system's been around since 1892, by the way, which is when it was designed by a group of progressives called the Committee of 10 who were thinking about the needs of the 20th century. We haven't updated it in 120 years. What I want is every citizen in this country, every child in this country to start at pre-K. And I want them to get something after high school, either community college or career and technical training, for free as part of basic public education. So I want the federal government to create incentives to stretch that educational pathway from K through 12 to pre-K through 14. And then I also want to put resources behind early childhood education. Because if you look at the data, it's clear. Kids that start with early childhood education have a fundamentally different educational trajectory. In fact, there's been lots of studies out there that show that kids from more stable financial backgrounds start kindergarten having heard 3 times the words, not twice, 3 times the words that poor kids who have not had access to early childhood education. I mean, that's just a national embarrassment. It's a national embarrassment that we let these young people, because of the condition of their birth, start their public education experience so far behind everyone else that they never catch up. So I want to also massively expand early childhood education in low-income communities to make sure those kids have a shot. But there's other stuff, you know, there's simple stuff we got to do. You know, my wife and I funded a program in Baltimore called Vision to Learn. You know what Vision to Learn does? It drives around a van to public schools in inner city Baltimore, and it has an optometrist on board. And if teachers think their kids need glasses, they can make an appointment when the van pulls up and the kid goes on the van. And if the kid actually needs glasses, they pick from 10 different frames that are right on the van, and the next day they're delivered to the school. You know, one of the main reasons kids drop out of school is because they can't see what's going on in the front of the classroom. How crazy is that? You know, a federal program providing some matching funds to create those kind of programs, you know, you got to look at evidence, you got to look at facts, you got to figure out what's going on, and you got to build programs to solve the problem.
Thank you. At this time, 1 minute for closing remarks.
Wrap up?
Wrap up.
Those were good questions. I was hoping there'd be more. So, I hope you can tell from my remarks, I'm about real solutions. Because that's what I think this country needs. If you think about what's happened to our country over the last several decades, it's actually pretty simple. The world's changed really fast. What's caused all that change? Technological innovation and globalization. These things have been incredibly positive, but they've caused a huge amount of our country to be left behind. And they're changing everything in our society. They're changing our economy, they're changing the future of work, they're changing our security risks, they are changing how we interact with each other. And what the federal government has failed to do is to do anything to prepare our citizens and our communities for that change. We've been too busy fighting, and we haven't spent enough time doing. Whether it's on education, which is way outdated for the needs of our society, whether it's on health care. You know, my dad was a union electrician. He had one job for 60 years. Probably made sense to have health care tied to your job. I think one of my 4 daughters might have 15 jobs in her life. Does anyone actually think having your health care tied to your job is a good system? We should absolutely have a universal health care system. That's what you'd be doing if you were thinking about the future, if you were thinking about where the world is going. If you were thinking about where the world is going, you'd have pre-K through 14, because you know you get much better outcomes for all of our citizens when you expand that educational pathway. So I'm running for president to be the person that actually gets this stuff done, with real solutions, based on facts, based on evidence, based on analyzing what's going on in our society, based on taking some of the big institutions of our society like education, healthcare, housing policy, which are set up in many ways to be structurally biased, and I would argue perpetuate institutional racism, and reforming those institutions and making change so that we start getting different outcomes, so that the condition of your birth or your geography of your birth does not determine your future. Because I believe in opportunity for every American, no matter where you're from, no matter who your parents are, no matter what your neighborhood's like. Everyone deserves a shot. And that's not going to happen unless we actually get to work, roll up our sleeves, look at the problems in society, and actually start solving these problems. And that's, my friend, why I'm running for president. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get this. Thank you, Representative Delaney. At this time, we'd like to welcome to the stage Admiral Joe Sestak. Admiral, pleasure to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. May I say hi?
Welcome.
Joe.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm Joe Sestak, and I wore the cloth of our country for 31 years. But I joined up during the Vietnam era. And that's when I began to see and live with the systemic as well as the overt discrimination that was even in the great institution of our military. There were race riots on the aircraft carriers during that Vietnam era when I was there. The very first week I was aboard my ship, the African-American community stepped off. All the sailors stood there during lunchtime, at attention in a hot burning sun. And they did it repeatedly, professionally, to voice their concerns that they were being discriminated against in fair evaluations, as well as the next job assignments. We eventually worked ourselves through this and had a man of color, General Colin Powell, become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it's why today, if you go to the African-American community, you will find, as I did when I went to 200 of their churches when I was running for Senate in Pennsylvania, that they have high respect for the military because it is one of the ways for them to get a fair opportunity to be all they might be. Is it perfect? Far from it. I can remember commanding a ship in the Persian Gulf and pulling into the United Arab Emirates And as I went through the ship, I found the N-word somewhere. So I called the entire crew out onto the pier before we went on liberty and said, I'll find you, and I'll kick your ass out of our military. You don't belong here. I never found them, but I never forgot that, because it isn't just write rules and regulations, it's whether how well you enforce them and follow through with them. And that's the damage that's been done with redlining, as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has disappeared in this administration. And the Civil Rights Division isn't doing what it should be doing in enforcing the proper rules and regulations and laws that have been passed. I got out of the military when my daughter got brain cancer, went and became the second Democrat since the Civil War to represent a nearly 2-to-1 Republican district. And in it, we had the oldest historical black university and college, Cheney University. I visited it 17 times at the invitation of the NAACP at about the 4th or 5th visit, because the students had sued because they were being given inequity, the lowest of the 14 colleges and universities that are publicly provided for in our state of Pennsylvania. They were getting the least funding per student. We fixed that at a meeting in my office to where they came up near number 1 and got direct appropriations so they could have a math building there. But there were other things to be done during my time. But the African American community paid me back. When I ran for Senate, I found that I was running against my party's desire, because Arlen Specter, who had tried to humiliate Anita Hill, the African-American woman who had brought her claims of discrimination, allegations of discrimination against now Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, our fine president endorsed him all the way down, but I disagreed and put a video out about that hearing and ran against my party's desires, shut out from going to all the wards, the Democratic wards in Philadelphia, which is about 1/3 of the votes in a primary. I went to those 200 African-American churches at their invitation. I won that primary, but I lost the general. After going back to the 200 churches to say thank you, I went to teach and lecture at Cheney University. I also worked in a nonprofit instead of taking a lobbying job in Philadelphia. As you may know, there are certain districts in Philadelphia among the African-American community where the infant mortality rate is worse than it is in Syria. And so we worked on early child education, not gentrification, but trying to make sure that people stayed in place with the right early childhood, and also with the training of hands and mind, not always having to go to college. And then I also always visit a prison every year, because that's where my vets are, who came home from Vietnam and did not have any understanding from a society what PTSD was, and hired one of them in order to be part of my next campaign staff. There's a lot to be done, but my first effort when I came here 3 months ago and declared for this candidacy after my daughter's brain cancer came back, and I had to pay back my nation a second time for the health care that saved her, I went to Waterloo before my first political event, the First Antioch Baptist Church, where the pastor is a vet, just to say thank you to a demographic that supported me. And as I left a few days later, I got a call from the prison that I visited every Veterans Day. And the head of that Veterans chapter called an African American is in for murder. That happened decades ago because he had PTSD and was never acknowledged about it and couldn't get the help he needed. Hey, Joe, I just want you to know, the guys have heard that you're running for president, and we're going to organize Philadelphia for you. And I'm sure they will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral. You mentioned you were having taught at a historically black university. What attracted you to that university, and can you share some of how it might have shaped your perspective in general, and then how it might have shaped your economic policies in particular?
I was the first congressional representative in decades who ever went to Cheney University to visit it as I was campaigning. And I was taken by the isolation of the university out there. They had closed down the railroad train line that used to go there. And then I went back before I was sworn in, and I was the only Caucasian who went to see to the funeral, a memorial service of the wonderful 60 Minutes man of fame who had gone there. And his class came back. There was such heft and wealth not wealth in money, just wealth in who they were, of those who had come back for his memorial service. And I sat there, not yet sworn in as a congressman, and compared who they were when that university used to be the only place, among others, that African Americans could go. And then it wasn't getting equity and funding any longer. And so the reason I went there 17 times was to try to, like a good captain of a ship, you go down and talk to the boiler technicians who aren't recognized very often where the combat operations are, to bring, I brought President Clinton there when he did, I used to work for President Clinton in the White House for 3 years as Director of Defense Policy. So when I did an event with him, I brought him to Cheney. It was the disparity I saw from what historical black universities had been and what they weren't. I went to Pennsylvania's state legislature and testified in order to get support for them. I voted for $510 million in the budget down there in Congress to try to get there. Why? Because they weren't being given an equal opportunity to be all they might be. They were being discriminated against in funding, and that is kind of why I went back to teach there. I owed the Afro-American community 200 churches welcomed me in when the congressman who ran Philadelphia said, you can't come to any of our wards when I was running because of Anita Hill. No, I owed them to go and teach. And that's why one of my students had been in prison 10 years. I believe in recidivism and reentry, and you better put your, your actions where your mouth is, and I hired him as part of my Senate. It was a payback tour, and I went there purposely because of the support they gave me and a need to be there, I thought, to help bring it back up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral, you mentioned this earlier in your opening statement, but the American military has been more successful at offering equal opportunities for all races than any other institution in America. In your opinion, what does the military do that the rest of government and private industry should do?
What we do is that wonderful frame you heard me say earlier. We're a meritocracy, probably the one meritocracy that's left. However, you can only expect what you inspect, that I mentioned before. We go out, and when there's a promotion board, someone comes up and reviews the results to make sure they were fair. So, for example, as an admiral, there was a selection board in order to go to graduate school, and it came before me to do the objective review, and I said, this individual has a better record than the others. Why wasn't he equally promoted? They took it back, redid it, and he was. I couldn't direct it. And that's the failure we have today. Take the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I've written an op-ed that was published in one of the papers here this past month where it said that bureau really should be called the People's Bureau. The work and effort they have already done before this administration of finding out where redlining was being done in the African-American community was enormous. And I just don't mean on mortgages. I mean in education. I mean in healthcare. And that was their tasking. And so that's what we tend to do in the military. We learn integrity's values, service to others, to country above self, and accountability and answering for oneself. And when men and women come into our service, that's the standard they're judged to. But we always make sure that when you have a promotion board or job assignments, someone reviews that to make sure that that's still present, because you can't control human behavior. You can incentivize it, but you make sure that that behavior of somebody doesn't discriminate in the results of what should be a meritocratic process. And that's how we do it.
You introduced legislation to establish an Office of Minority Entrepreneurship and Small Business Development. Why do you find it critical to establish such an office?
It's because I was vice chairman of the Small Business Committee. I asked for a waiver to be on a third committee. I didn't think I was going to get it, but they gave it to me. Then they asked me, do you want to be vice chairman? I thought they wanted to show they had a sense of humor. It normally takes 10 to 12 years for that. Now, nobody goes to Small Business Committee because there's no PAC money there. They go to Appropriations and Energy, but it was the cat's meow for me because the majority of Americans work in a small business. So then I dug into the stats and found out that African Americans are the ones that have the least default rate of anyone who gets a loan from Small Business Administration. And so I propose legislation because I do believe in universal approaches, but I think you have to target when there is a problem and discrimination, because the application fee for that, if you remove it, because it's a small fee, also opens up more to get in. Studies have been showing. So I wanted to have a targeted office in there that focused upon, and as you said, it's called the minority entrepreneurship. And so I meant it for both African Americans and Latinos primarily. You walk the streets of Philadelphia, and that wasn't my district, but I walked them. And small businesses is what's truly missing, because we're only creating half as many small businesses today as 30 years ago, and they can't get the startup money to begin, the mother's milk. And by having an office in Small Business Administration and aiming it towards those who are disenfranchised, you might be able to get the money back down to community banks with no fee, and they don't even have a big default rate and start businesses starting up again. They create 70% of all jobs. Why not target that? And so that's why I did it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral, at this time, we have a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Jordan Abrams.
Yes, sir.
Morning, Admiral. If you become president, would your plan to create economic opportunities for African Americans include those who are ex-convicts so they can rebuild their lives and provide for their families?
Yeah. I just got back from New Hampshire, and I'm glad you brought up convicts, because, or those who are incarcerated. As I walked 105 miles across New Hampshire here last month, I stopped in and did 5 or 6 events a day. One of them was to the prison they have there, the most progressive prison in all of America, in order to visit my vets. And I have a whole chapter in my book I wrote in 2015 on recidivism, untapped resources. I've sold 6 copies of the book. but it's a good one. It's on policy. And that's why, every year, again, it's to your question, show yourself to what matters. And so that's why this Veterans Day, I'll go again back to Grady Ford Maximum Security Prison to visit the 175 vets who are there, and every year I try to visit them, even after I was congressman. So the reentry programs that we must have to be 2 different ones, one for women, one for men. All stats show you that what you appeal to for a man when he comes out of prison is his ego. You're of worth. But for women, and this is why women are better leaders in the military, we found out at a junior level, because they have a small group of 20 sailors they have to command. They care about a network. They care about bringing teams together. That's how they find their self-worth. How do I know that? A study at Cheney University, where I had a student research the best recidivism program, because we were incarcerating 80% more women every year, mainly African-American Pennsylvania, and I wanted to find out why and how do we fix recidivism. So I intend, based upon evidence-based recidivism program, to your wonderful question, how to focus upon convicts and all. But how do you take care of the businesses here? My gosh, the unemployment rate in this nation, everybody thinks, as a state, is 2.3%. It's not. It's 6.2%. In the African-American community, it's not 11%. Here in Polk County, it would actually be about 22% if you looked at those who are artisans that work with their minds and their hands, the enlisted men and women of the Navy, so to speak, the ones without college degrees, who lost their job, and we spend less than any developed nation on labor force training, 0.001% of GDP. Can we fix student loans in a heartbeat? That's easy. There's a repay program that mandates you don't have to pay back more than 5 or 6% of your income, disposable income, and it's forgiven after 20 years. We just push everybody into that. But what about the labor force? And that's why I worked in that nonprofit in Philadelphia to get the skills to train and retrain. It's what we do in the military. We don't kick you out if you lose your job in a coal mine. We retrain you at the Air Force Community College. And second, small businesses. If we can get the mother's milk, the startup money through the loans that was mentioned over here, and also remove the 40% higher regulation on small businesses, and there's an office called the Small Business Advocacy Office, where they have 6 economists, 6 lawyers who peer through and take $2 billion a year off of small businesses of regulation that shouldn't be there. And there's another one, I won't bore you with, it's in the book, you can be the 7th one to buy it, is what we need to do is get those laborers trained and retrained. And number two, get the small businesses going again, and then you get the demand for labor. Their wages go up as businesses, because businesses create 70% of all jobs, only creating half as many as we used to 30 years ago, and you focus on those two, and that's how I would do it. College education, sure, but I told you how I'd fix that. Increase the Pell Grants like I voted for and things like that, all right? But we just don't do, no one pays attention to small business except with your lips. No one really goes and advocates on it. It's got to become a senior cabinet position.
Thank you, Admiral. At this time, we'll offer you a 1-minute close.
Thank you. Sorry for the long. Thank you very much. I only got in this race in June. I've been living in the Econo Lodge down the road at Earl May Highway. Yes, for 3 months. I just checked out because I got to head back to New Hampshire and all. But look, I got in this race different. The first time I got in the race for Congress, I got in because I had to pay back my country. They gave the health care plan that saved her from glioblastoma, when 8% of kids have ever survived, and no adult, hardly any has ever survived, like poor John McCain, my fellow Naval Academy classmate. I went to war on the ground in Afghanistan for Brief Period, command and carry a battle group, but when I came home, my 4-year-old daughter was saved. That's the whole reason I became a congressman in nearly 2-to-1 Republican district. F from the NRA, 100% NARAL pro-choice, but they re-elected me by 20 points, and I didn't spend a penny on a campaign ad of the $3 million I raised. We learned how to disagree well. I ran against my party's desires when they wouldn't defend Anita Hill. And they embraced the man who tried to embarrass her. But I learned in politics, even though I beat him, it's better to offend God than a politician, because at least God will give forgiveness. And I didn't have their support in the general. I got in this time for a different reason. My daughter's brain cancer came back last year. And your health care plan you provide us, as even retired military, saved her again. But I'm running for a different reason. I am running because I believe our Hobson's choice, our only choice, is not just to beat Mr. Trump, which we must do for the character of our nation. We must have somebody, once again, that the people will trust. All people, because they know that he will be accountable to them. Above self, above party, above any special interest, regardless of the consequences. There is no way we will meet the defining challenge of our time without a united America. And that's how we were. During John F. Kennedy's time and during Ronald Reagan's time, even if you disagreed with the president, we were not ripped apart. And then someone with a global experience of depth and breadth, who's been to war and understands that militaries will stop a problem, they will never fix a problem. And Iraq is the prime exhibit A for that, as I just got off of Fox and tried to explain it to them today, an hour ago. If we don't convene this world under the liberal world that we once led this world, despite the tragic mistakes of Iraq, Vietnam, and others, we will never protect ourselves from that damage of climate change, never find the rise of an authoritarian world order. And nobody really understands any longer that if you're ever going to use our military as commander-in-chief, you better know how it's going to end before it begins. I am running to beat Mr. Trump, to unite this nation, convene this world in order to protect and enhance our American dream with this world together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
That was it. Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to welcome to the stage Mr. Andrew Yang. Welcome. Good morning. Thank you.
Am I on stage?
Not for you.
I was like, oh, things for me to say. I'm just kidding.
Is this mic on?
Is my mic on?
You can just scream, it's okay.
See if you got it.
Just kidding.
Where's your pat that?
Oh, there we go.
It's on. Yeah.
Whoa.
Got it.
There we go. Good morning, Drake University. Good morning. It's fantastic to be here. Am I addressing and then you guys?
Yep, 3 minutes, please.
3 minutes, fantastic. Thank you all, and thank you for waking up this fine Saturday. Is it Saturday? When you run for president, days of the week, so start to lose their meaning. Whoa. It's the Russians. questions. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I grew up the son of immigrants in this country, and that had its own set of experiences, shall we say. When I say to people of color in this country, I say, I had words working against me, but black people in the United States have numbers working against you. And numbers are much more cruel and harsh and unyielding than any words. Now, the challenges ahead, and I love this opportunity to talk about economic freedom because to me it is so fundamental. And according to the best studies, African American median net worth will go to 0 in 2053. Now, how is that possible? How is it possible that the projections say that African American median net worth will go to 0 in 2053? It's because we know that we are getting rid of the most common jobs in our country today. Retail, call centers, truck driving, manufacturing. These jobs are disappearing. It's going to be particularly disastrous for communities of color. This is what I think of as an economic natural disaster. And who suffers most in a natural disaster? We know. It's people of color with lower levels of economic resources, access to capital, and access to path forward. So we need to create a new way forward for all Americans, and this is not something that's original. The proposal I'm championing, $1,000 a month for every American, was championed by Martin Luther King in 1967 in his book, Chaos or Community. And it is what he was fighting for the day he was assassinated in 1968. And to me, it's problematic that we celebrate Dr. King's birthday every year without celebrating the truth of his message. That if we are going to address the economic imbalances in this country, we need to set a new foundation. We need to have a guaranteed minimum income for every American. And though it is decades overdue, it is not too late to make this happen in 2020. Thank you all very much.
Mr. Yang, you've called on the federal government to do more to ensure equal pay for equal work. 10 years ago, Congress passed the President Obama's Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which expanded the time frame for filing claims of ongoing workplace discrimination. What legislation would you what legislation would you propose to go further?
There should obviously be equal pay for equal work. But one thing I want to bring in is the women who right now are not in corporate workplaces, who are moms like my wife Evelyn, who's here in the audience today, who's at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic. So the goal should be to start recognizing all forms of work that are done in our communities. If we put a new foundation in place, that will start recognizing caregiving, nurturing, and parenting, as well as helping women leave exploitative work environments. But there should be equal pay for equal work, and the fact that we're still fighting about that in 2019 is a sign of how far we still have to go.
Thank you.
Good morning. Your plan for a $1,000 a month universal basic income for all wouldn't address some systemic or structural problems like racial bias or lack of affordable housing or adequate funding to ensure good schools. What would you do about those?
I could not agree more that this $1,000 a month freedom dividend is just a foundation or a floor. We need to address the inequities in our educational systems. We need to address the inequities in our criminal justice systems, in our housing. Sorry, I keep wanting to move every time. In our housing systems. The truth is that in America today, the solutions often follow the money, the buying power. If we want to help African American businesses flourish in these communities, we need to put money into African American consumers' hands. If we want to help rebuild schools, we need to put more money into families who can then start strengthening those schools through property taxes and a higher tax base. It begins with putting the economic resources into our hands, and then we'll be able to strengthen our institutions from the ground up. But I could not agree with you more that the foundation is just the beginning. We need to address the systemic and racial biases in all of our institutions. That's a generational challenge that will not happen overnight. The way to make progress is to try and balance out the economic buying power in a way that you can directly influence as a government.
Thank you. At this time, we'll have a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Dante Powell.
Hey, Dante. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Morning, Andrew. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Dante.
Cool. Yeah. All right, Andrew. What's the future of law enforcement that allows us to dismantle and rebuild it systematically without allowing the pillars of racism that currently exist there to just resubmit themselves? And how do you create trust with black citizens to allow us to participate in that?
Come on now.
Every time something happens where an innocent black woman is shot in her own home because of a police officer who's responding to a call, it's a tragedy for all of us. And you see this happening over and over again. And we have to do more. We have to invest in community policing to fundamentally transform police attitude toward the communities that they're meant to serve and protect. We have to invest in making the police force more diverse and more representative of the communities that they're in. We have to dismantle our criminal justice system that is consistently tilted against people of color in this country. We should get rid of all private prisons because there is no reason for a prison to have a profit incentive. We should get rid of this cash bail system that's literally throwing Americans in jail for being poor. And we all know that many of those Americans are people of color. So there's a lot of work to do. There are some technical solutions that are at least starting to make a little bit of progress, and it's brutal to say this, but at least the police officer who shot that woman in Texas in her own home is now being held up on charges, in part because that footage was captured on his body cam. As president, I would supply a body camera to every police officer in the entire country and create a precedent where if you don't have the footage, then we'll look at you and say, how could you not have the footage? Because there's a camera on your person at all times. We're in a society right now where hotel clerks and convenience store clerks have cameras on them all the time. And they don't have firearms that can kill us at any moment. So if you're a police officer, we should hold you to the same standard that we do a convenience store clerk.
Mr. Yang, good morning.
Hi.
Hi. Iowa's minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 an hour. You don't support a federal minimum wage. Don't you think that profitable private businesses should be required to pay their employees a living wage?
That's not correct. I do support a higher minimum wage.
But not a federal one.
I support a higher federal minimum wage. To me, no one should be working in this country and be poor. That is not what this country should be about. Now, what you're suggesting is because I'm recommending that we just give every American $1,000 a month, free and clear, which would be an effective $6 an hour raise on top of the current minimum wage. And it would recognize the work that's being done that right now is not getting a paycheck. So that's the caregivers and nurturers. Mm-hmm. So if you had a choice, I would rather just give people the money directly because that would actually bolster small businesses rather than ask the small businesses to pay consumers, to pay their employees more. But if you had a choice between elevating the minimum wage and doing nothing, I would 100% elevate the minimum wage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Yang, at this time, we'll offer you a 1-minute closing remarks.
Thank you. This has been a great weekend for me and the campaign because Americans are waking up to the fact that we are failing you, the younger generation of this country. We have left you an awful mess and somehow we have blamed you for it. I'm here to say that you have nothing to do with it and that we, as the adults of this country, owe you better. We have to say to ourselves, right now the kids are not all right, and we have to change that. As a parent, we have to change that. We have to be able to look at our children and say, we have provided you a future that is as bright as the lives that we have led as your parents. There are going to be big steps necessary to make that the case because the challenges are unfortunately monumental and growing more extreme all of the time. We're here in the great state of Iowa, and you all have the future in your hands. This is one of the only places in the country where your votes can actually flush the pipes of all the lobbyist cash and restore a government that will try and improve your lives and your future, so we can look you in the eyes and say, we have left you a world that is as good or better than the ones that we inherited from our parents. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got a break. In a minute. Yeah.
Sure.
Let them know. Good afternoon, folks. We'll take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11 o'clock.
Are we all taking a picture? Oh, yeah, thank you for coming.
Marvin, we need some volunteers to help get phone calls. Mayor. Marvin.
Oh, okay.
Help control the stage. Everybody's walking up. Like, we're going to need to put some folks off here in like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get close.
Thank you, man.
Joe.
So he can just come right out here and
Right,
speak
but
from
you
here?
need to talk to your sound guy, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've already maybe done that, but
we
let
did.
me double check. So, hello. Hi. Hi. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
thanks.
much.
Yep,
He has some specific remarks he wants to give.
Yeah,
and
no,
we could have a
that's-
podium. And if you have it out here, why not? You
Yep,
know? So we
totally
really
okay.
appreciate that.
Yep, I just wanted to make sure that we're,
Okay.
I know what's going on for
I
the
know,
person
I
asking
know,
the question.
sorry,
Yeah,
I
no,
know,
you're fine. It's Miss you, right?
Yeah, so good
thanks.
to see
Yeah,
you.
it's
Yeah,
nice to meet
I
you.
remember you.
Thanks
yeah.
a lot.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
How you doing today, John?
Hello, everybody. I know we're having a lot of fun. I know we got a lot of things going on. We got all these people here. We got Andrew Yang hanging out in the crowd. I know it's amazing. But we want to make sure that we're keeping everything on schedule. So I would love it if everybody can start getting settled back into their seats, because we want to make sure that you can hear from everybody that is here, because we know that you want to make your decisions coming up as this February starts to roll over.
Okay. You know what? I told Cameron I wouldn't speak, but I'll just say
Man, I'm getting old.
hello.
Great job.
We're doing it. It's not me. It's not me.
No,
So,
you're part of this meeting.
yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
I shouldn't say it's not me, but I just want to say, yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. I appreciate that. I love you for saying that.
Okay, I'm supposed to go
Marvin,
be Yang.
come here. Good. How you doing?
Just wanted to say hi.
We have Right. And I was gonna come meet you, then everybody. How you doing? I'm doing well.
You know, I'm awake, surprisingly. It's a little swollen this morning, but we're good. Yeah.
You had a lot of cases here.
I do? Oh, I appreciate that. It means a lot.
No, I mean it. I don't want to smoke. I really don't. You know, you really do. It's good to see your face. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
I do.
I appreciate
All right.
it. My mom is from around, so wherever she's at, I got introduced to you.
Lord, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she's excited to be here.
All right.
Take care.
I want to run back and see Yang. I'm supposed to go back and see Yang.
Yeah.
The thing you would show me.
Yeah, just make
Oh,
sure
good.
Cameron knows that I will just say really quick. How are you? How's everything going? You feeling good? Okay. Good. I'm just here to do a compliment. Betty is going to just say
She's sure. Okay.
Hey, y'all. I'm going to bring everybody back together. I'm going to ask everybody to get seated and please get set back into that listening mode. We're going to be bringing up here Betty Andrews, who is the state conference president for the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP, and she's just going to say a few words to all of us before we get Michael Bennet up here. So thank you again for being here today, and we appreciate y'all's presence.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Betty Andrews. I'm president of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP. I represent, thank you. Thank you. I represent over 30 units of the organization across both states, and I am just thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled with the turnout. I'm thrilled with the interest. And I know that sometimes, I heard in another NAACP town hall, that sometimes when in forums like this, people think that we are preaching to the choir. Well, the answer is, yes, we are preaching to the choir because we need the choir to sing. We need you to sing. And not only that, we need you to make sure, our national theme is, when we fight, we win. Say that with me. When we fight, when we fight, and of course the NAACP has been fighting for over 110 years, fighting from the very beginning against lynching, fighting against Jim Crow, fighting for jobs, and we have been fighting and we will continue to fight. And you may ask me, how are we fighting now? Yes, we're fighting through protests. Yes, we're fighting through legislative action and lobbying. But also, we are encouraging you. We know that this is important. Today's topic is very national, and that's extremely important, but also locally, it is important. So just a reminder, choir, that November 5th, we need you to help us fight so that we can win. We need you to help us fight so that we can win. And the way you do that is not only do you make sure that you get to the poll, but because you're the choir and you're gonna sing to several other people and make sure they get to the polls. Because our local elections also matter. So we have a mayoral race coming up, we have school board coming up, and that is important. So when we fight, and when we vote, thank you very much.
Betty. Thank you, Betty. At this time, we're actually going to move this out the way. We would like to bring Senator Michael Bennet to the stage. Please help me welcome him.
Good morning.
Senator.
Thank you.
Pleasure to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Where would you like me?
Please, anywhere you'd like to be.
Well,
We'll offer you 3 minutes for opening remarks.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your having me here, and I'm looking forward to answering whatever questions you have and having whatever conversation you'd like to have. I was very fortunate. I had the privilege before I was in the Senate to be the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, a school district of 95,000 kids in Denver, Colorado. Most of the kids are kids of color. Most of the kids are kids living in poverty. About 57% of our kids were Hispanic, and about 20% are African American. We made enormous progress in some sense while I was there and after. We more than doubled the graduation rates of our kids of color, more than doubled the college-going rates, dramatically reduced the interactions with the local law enforcement, put a restorative justice system in place. I was just having a conversation with a young person here from a Des Moines high school, asked her, what's the one thing you would change about your school? And it's the interaction with the disciplinary system. But having said all of that, we still have huge achievement gaps in the Denver Public Schools, as we do all over this country. And I think unless we can contend with those gaps, we're going to have a hard time dealing with the disparities that exist throughout our entire society. Hello. I had the opportunity during this campaign to visit a place in South Carolina that's referred to as the Corridor of Shame. It's an area where there are 15 high schools where nobody's taken an AP class in the last 2 generations. about 100% African American. I had a meeting with about 60 people from the community in this very rural community that had brought a lawsuit that became part of Brown versus Board of Education. Actually, the lawsuit was brought before Brown was even brought. And there were these two women who had come, they were in their early 80s, and they had moved away. And the reason they'd moved away is their families had been involved in that lawsuit and they couldn't live there anymore. And only in their old age did they come back to the community. And they came to see me at this meeting, and at the end of the meeting, one of them said, they were sisters, one of them said, we wanted to come here because we wanted to tell you that our schools are worse today than they were 70 years ago, and that our schools are more segregated today than they were 70 years ago. And I said, well, what is the solution to this after all this time? And she said, there is no solution except to vote. We have to vote people out of office that don't care about our kids, and we have to vote people in office that do care about our kids. And I guess I want to just close by saying people have been through fire in this country just to get to the point we are today, and we have a responsibility now, I think, to stand on the work that they've done and fulfill our obligation, because my generation's falling down on the job, and that's why I decided to run for president, because if we don't do something differently, we're going to be the first generation of Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people coming after us. So thank you for letting me be here with you today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. Senator, you state that you support increasing resources for individuals reentering their communities. Currently, there are a number of individuals who still sit in prison simply because they don't have housing. How do you plan to address the transitional housing needs of those attempting to reenter society? I think that we've got an incredible bias against people that have been incarcerated in terms of housing, in terms of hiring. We've got a 7.2 million shortage of affordable housing in this country to begin with. So I think that we've got to make sure that we strip the stigma away, we take away the bars on public housing from people that have been living, who have been incarcerated, and we've got to dramatically increase the availability of housing vouchers in this country, because only 10% of the people that are eligible for them can actually get them, including people that have been incarcerated. Thank you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
As superintendent of Denver Public Schools, you pushed an aggressive policy of closing underperforming and under-enrolled schools. In addition, you revamped Denver's merit pay system that left many veteran school teachers feeling wronged. Do you agree that these policies should be adopted across the country?
I agree that we should not continue to prop up failing schools that are destroying the lives of children in this country, and that and very often the kids that are in those schools are kids of color who are on the receiving end of policies that are discriminatory and make no sense. I'll give you an example. You mentioned teachers. There was a system in Colorado of what was called direct placement of teachers. If a teacher couldn't be hired in a school because schools didn't want them, they were then directly placed in our Title I schools. So our Title I schools, which are our poorest schools, became filled with teachers that the rest of the district didn't want to have. And I finally said, we're going to end that practice. And the way we're going to end it is we're not going to put another single one of these teachers in a Title I school. They're all going to go to the more affluent schools. And overnight, that process ended. We have got to redesign our education system to support our children. And when you think about, and our teachers, and when you think about the way we pay teachers, the whole system we have today was designed when we had a labor market that discriminated against women and said to women, you have only two professional choices. One's being a teacher and one's being a nurse. So we said, come teach Julius Caesar every year at Abraham Lincoln High School in Des Moines, and we're going to pay you a ridiculously low salary for teaching there, but if you stay with us for 30 years, we'll give you a pension that you can retire on. That sounded pretty good because your spouse would probably die before you. We haven't had that labor market for 40 or 50 years, but it's the way we're continuing to pay teachers. So the way I designed it in Denver doesn't have to be the way we do it all over the country. I'm happy to learn, you know, and grow, but I do believe as a nation, we have to turn our back on a system built on discrimination and figure out in the 21st century how we're going to pay teachers like the professionals that they are.
Thank you. At this time, we'll have a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Maria Filippone.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm great. Nationwide, blighted neighborhoods don't receive assistance for revitalization until gentrification begins, driving minorities and low-income people out. What are your specific plans to help revitalize blighted communities that don't involve gentrification, that keep people within their communities, providing opportunities for them and affordable housing?
Thank you for the question. We have had this problem in Denver in a big way. When I was the superintendent in Denver, it was very common to meet teachers who could afford to live in the city and county of Denver, and in fact, they did live in the city and county of Denver. Today, you can't live there, and neighborhoods that were neighborhoods with the kids that I worked for in the Denver Public Schools that were neighborhoods filled with poverty no longer are. They've been gentrified, and the people that live there are now gone, and mostly living in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. So my economic development plans and my housing plans are all based on the idea that we've got to do a much better job with inclusionary practices than we have to make sure that the people that are in the neighborhoods today can stay in the neighborhoods because of housing assistance, to make sure that as a nation we are rewarding communities with infrastructure dollars that are actually integrating their communities rather than segregating their communities, or prioritizing our infrastructure dollars to follow that integration, to make sure that we are rewarding the density of housing rather than the NIMBYism that exists today all over the country that's making it impossible for us to reintegrate our society. And that you can find that both in my housing plan and in my economic development plan. You're right, even well-intentioned legislation that I've seen passed in the Senate has resulted in even more gentrification, because the people, the investors on Wall Street are the ones that end up getting the benefit of it rather than the people who live there, and that ends up with gentrification as well. I have in mind the Opportunity Zone legislation that President Trump signed that I think, as I said, was well-intentioned, but in reality has been a windfall to people that were already at the top of the heap as it was. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
In an Essence magazine article, you called your tax proposals the most significant anti-poverty measures since Medicaid was passed in the 1960s. Please tell us a little bit about them and how they would directly affect income inequality.
Thank you very much. This, I wish this were an extra copy because I know how smart this guy is, but it's a much better way of doing what he's trying to do, in my view. So let me tell you what it is. So, since 2001, people don't know this. I hope I'm telling you something you don't know, but I didn't know it. Since 2001, we have borrowed $5 trillion from the Chinese as a nation, $5 trillion from the Chinese to give tax cuts to rich people in America. Yeah, that's been our priority. That's our priority when we've got the worst income inequality that we've had in 100 years. That is our priority. We're going to go into debt to give rich people tax cuts in this country and make our income inequality even worse. It's ridiculous. We borrowed another $5.6 trillion from the Chinese to fight 20 years worth of wars in the Middle East. That's 11 or 12 or 13 trillion dollars that, from the vantage point of people in this country, we might as well have lit on fire. So the first point to make is when people say we don't have any money, we ought to stop doing that stuff to begin with. And we ought to start investing in this country. Again, there's a report today out, I think it's a report by a professor at the University of Iowa showing that Iowa's actually going backwards now since the Civil Rights Movement. And all over the Midwest, we're more segregated than we were. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we haven't invested in our neighborhoods. We haven't invested in our people. The American Family Act, which is the bill that you're mentioning, would dramatically increase the child tax credit in this country, so much so that if you've got a kid under the age of 6, you'd get $300 a month. If you got a kid over the age of 6, you get $250 a month until that kid is 18 years old. Columbia University studied this, and they said that it would cut childhood poverty in America by 37%. It would end $2 a day poverty in this country. And that's why I say when Elizabeth says that her idea for Medicare for all is a big idea, I say it's a misplaced idea. Because I don't want to spend the next 10 years having that fight. Because the kids I used to work for in the Denver public schools, they need that $300 a month. And if you could reduce childhood poverty for 3% of the cost of Medicare for all, which is what that would cost, that would be the best thing you could do for educational equity in this country that I can think of. Because if you can reduce the circumstances of kids living in poverty, they're going to be able to learn, and they're going to be able to go to school. And parents are going to be able to make the decision about whether to spend the money in housing or education or early childhood education. And by the way, it does this without adding a single bureaucrat to the federal government. This is about putting money in the pockets of the people in our country that need it. And we can certainly afford to do it if we reverse the Trump tax bill. And it would be the most significant anti-poverty program that nobody's ever heard of, but now you have heard of it, so I hope you'll talk to other folks about it. We do that if we increase the earned income tax credit, if we have paid family leave and we increase the minimum wage. We might actually be surprised to find out that we live in a country where working people can actually save something again in the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. This time, I'll offer you 1 minute closing remarks.
Closing remarks.
Yes, sir.
I just want to say thank you for you to have me. I suppose this is 1 minute, so let me just say this. Somebody asked me the other day, it was a student, just the other day, asked me, a college student, what's the question you don't hear about on the campaign trail that you wish more people would ask? And what I told him was, it's a great question. What I told him was, people need to ask about the state of our education system. We have still not had a single question on the debate stage about K-12 education. If you went out to America and asked America, what does the Democratic Party stand for when it comes to education, the answer you would get back is free college. And I can tell you as a former school superintendent, I'm a lot more interested in free preschool than I am in free college. And I'm a lot more interested in what we can do for the 70% of kids that graduate from high school but never go to college, and what we're doing to put them in a position to earn a living wage when they graduate from high school, not the minimum wage. Not a kid should graduate from high school in this country without the skills and knowledge to earn a living wage. Not a single kid. That should be the equivalent of getting a high school diploma in America, because if it's not, a high school diploma is meaningless from the standpoint of creating opportunity in this country. So thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. You too. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Bye. See you soon.
Thank you, Senator. At this time, we'd like to welcome to the stage Senator Bernie Sanders. Thank you, Senator. You're well.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to share a few ideas with you. And let me begin by acknowledging that the NAACP has been one of the most important organizations in the modern history of this country. And one of the reasons we titled our comprehensive education reform program after Thurgood Marshall was to acknowledge the incredible role that the NAACP has played for so many years. Two issues. Number one, it goes without saying that as a nation, we must end all traces of racism, of sexism, of xenophobia, of homophobia, and religious bigotry. And we can disagree, as I do, with Donald Trump on virtually everything. But the ugliest thing that he is doing, which is really unprecedented, is trying to divide our people up based on the color of our skin, or where we were born, or our sexual orientation, or even our religion. As president, I see my task as bringing our people together as one people to fight for an agenda that works for all of us and not just the 1%. All right? Now, as I understand it, the title of this forum is Economic Freedom. So I know, obviously, you're the NAACP. We're going to work together to do everything we can to end systemic racism in America. But I think the point is, and remember the great March on Washington led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Everybody remember what the title of that march was? It was Jobs and Freedom, because Dr. King understood that if you're talking about freedom, you know what? You need an economic foundation to be free. You're sleeping out on the street, you're not free. If you're earning starvation wages, you're not free. If you're sick and you can't go to the doctor, you are not free. If you can't afford education, you're not free. So what we have focused on in this campaign is understanding that economic rights are human rights. Consistent, I think, with what you guys are talking about today. What does it mean? It means that we end the international embarrassment of the United States of America being the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a human right. Health care is a human right through Medicare for all. We end starvation wages in America. You ain't free. You're making $9 an hour in Iowa. We're going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. All right, I see the sign is up. I'm going to listen to the sign. But just getting warmed up here. Okay.
Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Why should the African American community place trust in you being able to help improve their economic well-being when some fear you are so far left that you will face difficulty getting legislation passed?
Okay. First of all, you might want to trust me because the ideas that I am advocating didn't come to me yesterday. I didn't hire some consultant to do a poll. You know what? I'm old, I confess. But the advantage from the voters' perspective is you have a lifetime of work to evaluate me. Didn't come up with these ideas yesterday. Way back when I was a kid at the University of Chicago, I got arrested in a demonstration opposing segregation in housing in the city of Chicago. You know what? That's what I've been doing for my whole life, standing up for justice. All right? And to answer your questions, my ideas are not far left. They are the ideas that the American people want. I'll tell you what's extreme. Want to hear extreme? Giving tax breaks to billionaires when 500,000 people are going to sleep out on the street tonight. You know what's extreme? Having a third of the African American children in America living in poverty. That's pretty extreme and radical. Do you think raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is extreme? Do you think health care for all is extreme? Do you think making public colleges and universities tuition-free is extreme? Do you think addressing the crisis of climate change is extreme? Do you think creating millions of jobs by rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure is extreme? Think making it easier for workers to join unions is extreme? Do you think ending the broken and racist criminal justice system is extreme? Do you think legalizing marijuana is extreme? Do you think canceling all student debt is extreme? I rest my case.
Senator, thank you for the crowd interaction. We'd like to get a little bit more crowd interaction. At this time, we'll have a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Tim Grover.
Tim?
Oh, Senator, how you doing?
I'm great.
Good. I know Medicare for all, you've got a lot of opposition, as
Yep.
you know, a lot more than I do about that. And one of those is the insurance companies.
Yep.
And since all politics is local, I got a daughter working for one of the insurance companies here in Des Moines. How would you address the issue of
Good.
employees, you know,
Good.
if you close down all the insurance companies?
Good. Okay. Let me be as clear as I can be. For the last decades, I have believed that health care is a human right. And I have believed that it is an international embarrassment that we're the only major country on earth not to provide health care to all. Now, right now, we are taking on the greed and corruption of the insurance industry and the drug industry that made $100 billion in profit last year, while 87 million Americans are uninsured, 30,000 die because they don't get to a doctor on time, and 500,000 people go bankrupt because of medical bills. So I believe, let me be straight out, that the function of a rational healthcare system is healthcare to all, without premiums, without copayments, without deductibles, and without out-of-pocket expenses. That's my belief. Now, the insurance companies disagree with me. They think it's great that they make tens of billions in profit while so many of our people are uninsured or underinsured. But because I believe health care is a human right, I will fight and succeed in passing Medicare for all. All right? Now, the question is, what happens to people who work in the insurance industry? That is a great question. Not dissimilar for the question, what happens to people who work in the fossil fuel industry as we move away from fossil fuel? You are looking at somebody who probably lifetime has the strongest pro-worker record in the United States Congress. Workers for the insurance company are not my enemy. The insurance industry, which is ripping off the American people and charging us the highest prices in the world, they are my enemy. So what we will do in the transition of Medicare for all is do everything we can to provide the training and the support that those people will need to transit into the provision of health care. Rather than somebody, and I obviously don't know what your daughter does, but rather than somebody driving you crazy because you haven't paid your bill or arguing with you because you thought you were covered in a policy that they say you're not, that's not a productive thing to do. We will need, under Medicare for all, millions of more workers into health care. Because once everybody has health care, we're going to need more provision. We provide home health care under Medicare for all. We provide dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses. There is more need for workers. We will transition those workers from sitting behind a desk arguing with you about whether or not you are entitled to the coverage you thought you were into a more productive area of providing real health care.
Morning, Senator. You have proposed to address discriminatory practices experienced by communities of color in the financial services, to revive the Postal Banking service, offering banking services through the post office with capped loan rates. Some critics worry that in that scenario, the Postal Service would lose a lot of money. What's your response?
No, they wouldn't. Look, one of the...
Okay.
You know, as you can tell, I have a lot of critics on every proposal. All right, but here is the truth. You go around the country, talk to people, go to Nevada, other states. One of the ugliest things that happens is when you are poor and desperate, instead of getting the help you need, you are taken advantage of and made even more desperate. So let's just say, as is the case, by the way, with millions of Americans, but even more so with the African American community, you can't pay your student debt, right? It happens very often. Your credit is shot. You can't borrow money at a reasonable interest rate. Where do you go? You go to a bloody payday lender. And I cannot think of an uglier profession, and we're going to take on the payday lenders now as well. Can you imagine, in this day and age, people being paid 50, 70, 80% interest rates? That is disgraceful. So we intend to use, which by the way exists around the world, use postal services, post offices, so for basic banking. So you can cash a check without paying an outrageous sum of money to do that. So you can borrow a few dollars, so you can have an account there. And this, right now, big banks are not interested in banking services for poor people. They don't make any money out of that. But we want to do that. I am disgusted by these payday lenders and their outrageous interest rates, and postal services the Postal Service can provide that service, which will be enormously helpful to low-income people. There are communities all over America. I don't know enough about Iowa, to be honest with you, but there are communities all over America where poor people cannot access financial services. It's nowhere near in the community. We will change that when we have the Postal Service providing basic banking.
Thank you. Senator, the average cost of child care in Iowa is $8,200 a year. This is beyond the means of many African-American households in Iowa. How would you both increase the availability of high-quality care while at the same time reducing the cost so providers can still have a livable wage?
The healthcare industry has done a good job in lying to the American people. Okay? We are the best healthcare system in the world. Really? Ain't the case. We spend twice as much. I want to emphasize this point. We are spending twice as much per person on healthcare as do the people of any other country on earth. I live 50 miles away from the Canadian border. If you have cancer or a serious medical issue, and you spend a month in a hospital in Canada where the health care is as good or better than it is in the United States, what's the bill that you have when you come out? How much do you owe? Zero. And they do that when you go to a doctor's office in Canada. You go to any doctor you want. How much does it cost you when you walk into the doctor's office? Zero. Now, if they could do that in Canada, if they could do a different form of that in the UK, in Germany, in Scandinavia, why can't we do that in the United States when we are spending twice as much per person? All right? And the answer is that the insurance companies and the drug companies make billions of dollars a year exploiting the needs of the American people. The function of healthcare is not huge profits. The function of healthcare is quality care to all people. And we will save money. You asked me how I apologize. Let me go on a half a second here. We save money because we end the profiteering of the insurance companies and the drug companies. I went to Canada a few months ago with people who are dealing with diabetes. Anyone know the cost of insulin in Canada compared to the United States? 1/10 the price. Got it? Because the drug companies in this country are out of control. So you take on the drug companies. You're not going to let them rip off the American people. In fact, on the Medicare for All, nobody pays more than $200 a year for prescription drugs. How's that? Okay? So, you also end the administrative nightmare that exists in a very wasteful bureaucratic system. So when we pay so much more than the people of any other country, we can, in fact, substantially lower the cost of health care for the average American, and that's what I intend to do.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. At this time, we'll offer you 1 minute for closing remarks.
Good, thanks. 1 minute?
1 minute. She'll get on you.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Look, we are in an unprecedented and pivotal moment in American history. That's the fact. We have a president who is a pathological liar, who runs the most corrupt administration in the history of this country, who is a racist and a sexist, who should be impeached and will be impeached. And if he is not impeached, I will defeat him in November.
I thought my question was about
2020. What we need to do is end the divisiveness in this country, which Trump and his friends are fomenting. We need to bring our people together. And as the title of this discussion talks about, we need to understand that in the richest country in the history of the world, economic rights are human rights, but we have to have the courage, it ain't easy, to take on the greed and corruption of the corporate elite and to tell those people on top that this country belongs to all of us, not just the 1%. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Hey, really thank you for holding in on the economic freedom vote.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Senator Sanders. At this time, we'd like to welcome Senator Kamala Harris to the stage. Good. Pancakes are going to happen this weekend.
Okay, right?
Right.
I'm serious about that. Greetings, everyone, and good morning. Good morning. I am honored and very happy to be with you this morning. There's a lot to talk about. Let me just start by saying what I've been saying a lot recently. I do believe in 2020 justice is on the ballot. And it relates to justice in a number of ways. It is about economic justice when we look at the fact that in America today, almost half of American families cannot afford a $400 unexpected expense. More than half of American families, a $500 medical bill will bankrupt them. When you look at the racial wealth gap in America and know that black families have 1/10 of the wealth of other families, when we look at the fact that an educational justice issue, when black students are graduating with a greater amount of student loan debt than other students, and 85% of black students graduate with student loan debt. When we look at health care, and health care justice is on the ballot, when we know that the black maternal mortality rate is such that black women die at 3 to 4 times the rate of other women in connection with childbirth. When we look at criminal justice is on the ballot. The system of mass incarceration that has led to black and brown men being incarcerated at levels that confound and that have really been about institutional racism in the criminal justice system. That has resulted in young black men and brown men being arrested and incarcerated for low-level offenses. Meanwhile, white-collar offenders are being getting off with a handshake. So these are all issues that are about justice. Justice is on the ballot in 2020, and I am prepared to be a president of the United States who fights for justice and for equality. And my history and my work and all of the work that has led me to this point give me what I know to be the confidence, but also the conviction to know that together we can address some of these issues and really fight for the America we believe in. So with that, I'll take the questions and thank you. Thank you all. How you doing? Hi, good to see you.
Senator, your first
Am I-
question,
okay.
yes, please sit, will actually come from the audience.
Well, I'm just going to stand.
I'd like to introduce you to Matt Gilbert, who is the Economic Development Chair of the NAACP Des Moines.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, Senator Harris. What is your plan to reduce barriers and increase access to technology and internet, especially for low-income children of color in rural and urban areas?
That's a great question. So as a proud graduate of an HBCU, Howard University, I will tell you, among my many areas of focus, a primary and very personal area of focus for me is what we need to do to better resource our HBCUs. Knowing that our HBCUs and other minority-serving institutions are the pipeline by which we populate all the professions with folks who are not otherwise present, and in particular around STEM, which of course is science, technology, engineering, and math. I actually prefer to call it STEAM because I think we should put art in there. And so what is it? Well, I have a plan that's about $60 billion going to our HBCUs in federal money. And that is partly to do what we need to do to build up the infrastructure of those schools. Last year, I actually got a bill passed, bipartisan, if you could believe it, to help with billions of federal dollars to HBCUs because the campuses are aging and they're literally falling apart. And so what does that mean in terms of educating these young, bright minds? Well, it means that they're going to school in trailers. It means that the library is shut down, and so they've got to go to some other campus to have access to the resources. So part of it is about infrastructure, but a larger part of it is about what we need to do to fund HBCUs around the research and development work that many universities do that allows them to grow and also produce students who can go out into the workforce knowing the best practices and being able to advance the mission of the profession. There is a subset of that is also, for me, about what we need to do to invest in entrepreneurship. And when we're talking about something like technology, the reality is that a lot of the people who are successful in technology are not going to big corporations. They are, in fact, we call them startups, but you also might want to think of them as entrepreneurs. So when I think of what we need to do to invest in entrepreneurs, I think about that also, what we need to do to invest in minority students, and for me, in terms of HBCUs, with an emphasis on African American students, what we need to do to give them all that they need to actually start up. And that's about capital and access to capital. That being said, on the issue of access to capital is one of the biggest burdens, one of the greatest hurdles by which any person, and certainly our minority communities and our Black communities in particular, can actually have access to economic health and progress. So let's think about that. One of the specific ways that people qualify for access to capital is they've got to have a good credit score. Like, let's break it down, right? Got to have a good credit score. Because the credit score is supposed to measure, which is why people rely on it, it's supposed to measure, are you responsible with money? Are you responsible with finances, right? In essence, if you just put it short form, it's about, are you a good bet? If I put my money on you, will you pay it back? Okay? Well, here's the thing about credit scores. You know what they measure? They measure things with an assumption that you already have access to wealth. They measure things like, do you pay your credit cards on time? Well, ain't nobody giving you a credit card if you don't have some money. They measure things like, do you pay your mortgage on time? Same point. You don't have a mortgage unless somebody had some money somewhere to buy a house. So I'm saying we need to reevaluate how we are measuring whether people are financially responsible. And so I'm prepared to extend what we're asking to ask these questions. Do you pay your phone bill on time? Do you pay your utility bill on time? Do you pay your rent on time? Because of these, of course, are also measures of whether you are financially responsible and therefore a good bet for me to then loan money, which of course is what we're talking about when we're talking about access to capital. And why is that so important? Because it is then that startup capital that allows you to start a business, be it a small technology firm, or it could be a beauty shop, or a barber shop, or a hardware store, or an accounting practice. And all of those small businesses, as we know, have historically been a source of the economic health, stability, and growth of our community. And when we invest in those businesses, we also know by extension that those business leaders are not only leaders of business, they are community and civic leaders. They hire locally. They are the ones who create initiatives that are about helping the families in the community. So all of these things, of course, are connected. So that's how I think about that issue and what I'm prepared to do. Thank you.
Senator. As you know, some African Americans have expressed concern about your past as a prosecutor and the Attorney General of California for your defense of the 3 strikes law and also the death penalty, which I know you're personally opposed to and is disproportionately used upon African Americans. But when a judge ruled that California's death penalty was illegal, you chose to challenge as Attorney General that law. You said you felt a professional obligation to do so. I'm just wondering, what do you feel are the limits to one's ability to make change from inside the system? Was that an opportunity where you could have done so?
I'm not sure which case or what you're talking about, but I will say this. As Attorney General of California, I was elected to be the lawyer for the state. And among my many responsibilities, I had the responsibility of being the lawyer for state agencies. And when they made decisions about what they wanted, We had to file documents according to what the client wanted. And sadly, I was not able, or would have literally been kicked out of my job if I had fired these clients. I could not fire clients. I have always been opposed to the death penalty. In fact, many of you may know my history on this, which is that within the first 3 months of having been elected a district attorney of San Francisco, there was a tragic case where a police officer was killed in the line of duty. It was the first such case in generations. And there was a lot of political pressure to say that I should have charged death penalty in that case. And I did not. And you know, I'm sure many people thought to my political demise, but obviously I'm standing to tell the story. So you can see my record to know that it is a deeply held belief that I have. And I'll tell you why. Look, the death penalty in America, we know, has been a system that, one, has been disproportionately applied against black people, brown people, and poor people. When people want to talk about the death penalty as being a deterrent for certain kinds of crimes, what I said to them, because I know this, having personally prosecuted homicide cases, nobody sits back and before they pull that trigger and decides, well, is this going to be life without possibility, parole, or the death penalty? So when people try to argue that we need the death penalty to deter crime, it's just a fallacious argument. It doesn't make sense. Let's also agree that science has done a lot of things to bring justice to the criminal justice system. And what science has allowed us to see because of DNA is that there are people who have been convicted and sentenced to death who were innocent. And when we are talking about the ultimate sentence, you better be 100% sure. And so I oppose it for a number of reasons, including it is state-sponsored homicide as far as I'm concerned. And for that reason, I will always be opposed to the death penalty. In terms of the criminal justice system, let me say this. I grew up a daughter of parents who were active in the civil rights movement. I grew up a black child in America. There is not a black man I know that is a relative, a friend, or even a coworker who has not been the subject of some kind of racial profiling or excessive force. When I made a decision to become a prosecutor, it was a very conscious decision. A very clear-eyed, eyes wide open decision. And my decision was based on this. Why should we only be on the outside when we are trying to change systems? Why not also be on the inside to force change from happening?
So thank you, just to follow up on that, do you not remember an instance where a judge ruled that California's death penalty was unconstitutional and you challenged?
Yes, let's talk, I didn't get to that part. Right. So in that one case, we're talking about what happened was that the proponents of that case were basically arguing that to get to the death penalty, to actually get to the penalty, it was taking too long, and therefore unconstitutional, because it was taking too long to actually kill somebody. Okay, that was the case, and therefore unconstitutional, because it was taking too long. I knew what they were up to, which is that part of the proponents of the death penalty have been trying for years to say, speed up the system. And to do it, they've been saying, part of the way that we should do it is let's not have such a high bar on the attorneys who defend death penalty cases. Let's let more attorneys take those cases, including those who are not specialists in defending death penalty cases. What they were saying is, let's shorten the appeals process. Let's not allow people who are on death row to have so many bases to actually challenge the death penalty. And you are right. In that case that you're talking about, I said no. I said no. I know exactly what they were up to. And that was why.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Senator, you have some ambitious proposals to ease the economic crunch for lower income people, including a $247 billion Lift the Middle Class Act,
Yes.
and a $42 billion Rent Relief Act,
Yes.
and a $100 billion plan to help the housing costs in historically redlined neighborhoods. How will you pay for all of these programs?
Well, first of all, let me just say that, this is not about you asking this question, but as a general matter, where were these questions when Donald Trump and the Republicans passed that tax bill benefiting the top 1% and the biggest corporations of America, which is leading to a $1.5 trillion deficit that you and your children and grandchildren will pay for? So here's how I think about it. When we're talking, I'm going to take the last one that you mentioned first. $100 billion that I'm prepared to put in federal dollars into historically redlined communities. Okay, why? Let's just do a quick memory of history, and I'm just going to go back to World War II. World War II, hundreds and thousands of American soldiers went to fight that war. We call them the greatest generation. When they came back, the United States government essentially said, you have been so heroic in the way you have fought for and served our country. We want to reward you, the greatest generation. And upon your shoulders, we will build the middle class. So there were federal government programs to help subsidize home ownership and the buying of homes by those, as we called them, greatest generation. Who was excluded from that? Black service members. Okay, then you look at the decades of redlining in which black families were excluded from buying homes, in particular in those communities that would see great value appreciation. Then you fast forward to an issue I worked on, which was the foreclosure crisis when the 5 biggest banks of the United States were engaged in predatory lending, focusing on black families, brown families, and immigrant families, and selling them homes without doing the due diligence and then foreclosing upon those families. What ends up happening? Well, we see, when you look at the issue of black home ownership, it is at the lowest rate that it's been since 1968 in America today. And let's talk about the significance of home ownership. This is about an economic justice forum. Let's talk about the significance of home ownership to the wealth of a family, much less a community, and put it in the context of intergenerational wealth. Well, Kamala, what are you talking about? Okay, one of the greatest sources of wealth of any family that gets passed through the generations is that home, from grandparents to children to grandchildren, right? Intergenerational wealth. So when our children say, Mom, I want to go to Howard University, and Mom can say, honey, you don't have to take out that predatory loan from that private loan servicer. I'll take equity out of my home to help you pay for tuition. Or the son says, Father, I'd like to start a small business. And the father says, son, you don't have to take out a loan from one of those predatory lenders. I'll take equity out of the home to help you start that small business. Intergenerational wealth. So $100 billion is going to families that live in historically redlined communities or families that live in federally subsidized housing to help them with closing costs or down payments to buy a home. Because if you want to deal with the racial wealth gap, a very specific part of the solution is to help families own homes. And when you do that, you build communities, and we have healthy communities, we have therefore safe communities, we have communities that thrive. Thank you.
Senator Harris, you've also expressed support for the idea of paying reparations for slavery. What would such a program look like?
I think that we need to get into the details of it, which is why I'm supporting Sheila Jackson Lee's initiative to do basically an analysis of the issue. And I'll tell you why. When we are looking at this issue, we are talking about systemic racism. And we cannot afford to oversimplify it, what that means. Because we are then talking about just what I just mentioned before around the housing issue, right? Nobody got 40 acres and a mule. on top of everything else I just said. We're talking about issues that relate to healthcare disparities, both in terms of issues like the undiagnosed and untreated trauma among Black children who are growing up in poverty. And let's be clear, poverty is trauma-inducing, or growing up in a community where there is violence and there is you don't need creative thought to know that the communities where you see violence are the communities that also don't have economic opportunity, which is what causes the outcomes that we see, not the other way around. So we're talking about housing, we're talking about mental health treatment, we're talking about public health care as a general matter when I talk about the Black maternal mortality issue, which is systemic racism, because let's be clear, when you study maternal mortality as it relates to Black women, what you will find is it does not matter her income or her education level. It literally has to do with the fact that she is a Black woman. And when she walks into that hospital, that clinic, or that doctor's office and talks about what she is experiencing, she is not being taken seriously. So then we're talking about education. We're talking about the fact that you look at the rates of discipline, suspension, and expulsion of, in particular, young Black boys, as young as kindergarten and first grade. Let's talk about all of these issues and understand that writing a check and then telling everybody, be quiet and go away, is not what we want or need. Therefore, I say, let us get into the detail and study it to talk about exactly how we are going to deal with the systemic racism that has occurred over hundreds of years, and what therefore then must be done to correct course.
Thank you.
This time, we'll offer your 1-minute closing remarks.
Well, there's so much more to talk about, but I want to thank the NAACP for hosting us and for this important conversation. Listen, when we look at this race in 2020, I think we know that we have, as I said, many challenges. Justice is clearly on the ballot. We have had a president of the United States who has been fanning the flames of hate and racism and xenophobia, and we are going to need to do a lot to heal and to correct course. And I am running for president because I know that when we overcome the injustices that we face, I know that we can unlock the promise of America and the potential of the American people. And I know that on that basis, that we can do all that is necessary to grow and to heal, but it must be based on speaking truth, which is what you have allowed to have happen on this stage today, and I thank you for that, and I thank you all for the time. Thank you.
It was Jefferson Ride.
Oh, you found out?
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Sorry I didn't get
Thank you to
that.
Senator Harris.
That's okay.
Thank you so much.
At this time, we would like to bring to the stage Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Thanks, Doug.
Hello. How you doing?
Mayor Pete, pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Well, good morning, and thanks for the chance to join you, and I'll just be brief to introduce myself so we can make the most of the opportunity to have a conversation. But I'm so thankful to be here in Iowa and so motivated about the possibility of a better country. There is a lot of focus, and rightly so, on the simple fact that the future of American democracy depends on bringing an end to the Donald Trump presidency in 2020, if not before. But I'm worried about what comes next. If you really picture what America is going to be like that first day the sun comes up and Donald Trump isn't the president of the United States, there's some relief, for sure, that we can put an end to that particular kind of chaos and corruption and racial spite emanating from the White House. But then we got to figure out what to do next. We have to pick up the pieces and build a different kind of future in a country that's going to be even more torn up by politics than we are right now, even more divided than we are right now, and one where the crises that helped us get here didn't take a vacation. They're only going to be getting more serious. And one of the ones that's on my mind right now is a crisis of belonging in our country. I think a lot about belonging because I grew up not sure if I would belong in this country, not sure what opportunities I might be denied, not sure if I'd be able to serve in uniform, not sure if I would be able to start a family. And rights in my life have come about not only because of the advocacy of people like me, but because of allies not at all like me. And I think about that a lot at a moment like this where everybody who has been on the wrong side of a wall of exclusion in American life, and in different ways, in very different ways, that's an awful lot of people, in fact, most people in this country. There's an opportunity to stand up for each other now. And when we talk about belonging, the black experience in America is an example, perhaps the example, of people who were in this country but not invited to be of it. Enslaved people and their descendants who built this country. It's been pointed out that our country didn't even become a democracy until advocacy and activism by black Americans, much of it on the wings of the NAACP, made this a democracy. And yet, even to this day, the black experience in so many ways might as well be of living in a different country. You look at the disparities in healthcare, the maternal mortality gap. You look at the wealth disparities that are even bigger than income disparities. You look at differences in life expectancy, just the basic measures of well-being in this country. And for very specific reasons, as a result of very specific policy decisions, it is a different experience for black Americans. The idea of the Douglas plan that I hope we'll have a chance to unpack in the questions is to recognize that it will take intention and it will take resources to dismantle systemic racism in this country. That you cannot replace a racist policy with a neutral policy and expect equality to just rise up on its own. It doesn't work that way. These inequalities came about on purpose, and they will not be reversed unless we act with purpose and with investments to do something about it. That is the backbone of our policy on equality. I'm looking forward to discussing it in more detail.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Mayor, you talk a lot about faith on the campaign trail, and I'm curious as to what role you see for faith-based programs in your administration in promoting economic sustainability, and how would you prevent such programs from discriminating against those who don't share their views?
Yeah. This is really important to me as a person of faith, and also a person who knows what it is to be subjected to somebody else's interpretation of their faith. And so I think the most important principle to uphold is this. We value freedom of religious expression in this country. We also recognize as a core constitutional principle that this country, and in particular public office in this country, stands for people of every religion and of no religion equally. And I think we can stand up for that principle and at the same time engage people of faith through policy and through politics and through movement politics. I mean, if you want to talk about a religious tradition, for example, that is not just what you see in the religious right, look no further than the tradition of the black church. And today, things like the Poor People's Campaign, faith-based movements that are reminding us of the call of faith to stand up for the marginalized. The scriptures that say that when you think of those who are in prison, you're supposed to imagine that you are in prison alongside them. The scripture that says that whoever oppresses the poor taunts his maker. I believe that we can honor the separation of church and state, and at the same time, set up a White House where those who are guided by religious principles don't have to wonder, whatever happened to I was hungry and you fed me, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Because these are also moral ideas that are common to a great many faith traditions. The teachings of Islam, the teachings of Judaism, the teachings of every moral tradition I've ever seen tell us that salvation has to do with what we do for those most in need. And that can animate our policies, our practices, and just the way that our leaders conduct themselves. Because also, there's an awful lot in faith tradition about how we're supposed to act, about the need to walk in humility and decency. And I think that anybody looking at this White House recognizes that people of faith have a choice, and that by no means does faith require that you embrace the sort of things going on in Washington right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor, what strategies would you implement to minimize the economic disparities between African Americans and their white counterparts?
All right. So really glad you raised this, because this is one of the core elements of the Douglas Plan. And we may not be able to get into all of it, so I hope folks check out the website and learn more about how it tackles systemic racism in every dimension of American life, from housing and home ownership to health, to the criminal justice system, to education. But maybe the thing that's not being talked about nearly enough among all of the dimensions where we can do something is economic empowerment. In our city, which is a low-income, diverse city, every time we come to the table, often with a conversation that begins around issues related to criminal justice or policing, by the end of the hour, we're talking about those issues and also how they can't be separated from the question of economic empowerment. The racial income gap, the racial wealth gap, reflect the fact that access and inheritance are a huge part of how people get ahead. I'm not just talking about the inheritance of a millionaire, I'm just talking about the difference between having a little bit to start out and not. Now, one of the reasons why we need to put resources into addressing economic inequality is that inequality compounds itself if you leave it alone. It's like compound interest. You save $1, and after a few years, it'll actually be $2, and after a few more years, it's $4. If you save $1 and you got 5% interest rate, in 150 years, that $1 becomes 1,000. Now, if that's true of $1 saved, that's also true of $1 stolen. So when the generational wealth of generations of Black Americans was stolen or impaired, that has consequences that won't get better on their own. So what can we do about it? One thing that we're proposing is what we call the Walker-Lewis Promise. It's named after Reginald Lewis and Madam C.J. Walker, pioneering Black entrepreneurs who created wealth and created jobs, not just creating wealth for themselves, but nobody has a better track record of empowering minorities than minority-owned businesses. So we're going to make sure that the federal government does, to the tune of 25%, does its business with businesses owned by people who have been historically excluded. We're also going to make sure that we have a debt for jobs program to support people who emerge from college. I'm thinking of some folks right here. Anyone eligible for a Pell Grant can get their debt deferred and eventually relieved if they start a business that creates at least 3 jobs within 5 years of graduating college. Because we need to lift up Black solutions that are coming from the entrepreneurial community that are going to create more opportunity for others. And we got to tear down barriers. The credit system right now is a barrier. There's a lot of inequity in access to credit. We're going to put more funding into CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions. These are the institutions that have a good track record of lending to the kinds of businesses that are excluded right now. And the federal government will co-invest in promising small businesses and enterprise, because right now what we're seeing is venture capital, almost all of it, is going to a tiny few. And there are a lot of what are sometimes called underrepresented, might be better to call them underestimated, businesses and business owners who could create a lot of jobs and a lot of wealth with that capital. We think we can unlock $10 billion with this federal co-investment effort, create jobs and create opportunity for the road ahead.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor. The fatal shooting of Eric Jack Logan and your handling of the situation has brought national attention to South Bend. How have you reached out to the African community in your town, and what lessons have you learned hearing their outcry?
So in June of this year, Eric Logan, a Black resident of South Bend, was shot by a white police officer. And it has been an extremely painful situation for our community. I've called for an independent investigation, and that's still going on as we speak. But what we learned right away as a community was we didn't have to wait for that incident to get answers in order to take steps that were empowering for residents in our community. So we immediately launched a process to assess what was happening, the structural factors that had so many people living in our community feeling like they couldn't turn to the police. And part of it is oversight. So we have a civilian body that I appoint that makes decisions over discipline and policy. It's actually a majority African American. But it wasn't viewed as a group that was really in public view. The public was invited to meetings, but it wasn't really a public process. So we created a community conversation, tough conversations, people who were sometimes facing off across protest and dividing lines, and literally sat down at a table. And one by one, we took up all of the areas where we knew we could do better as a community. Recruiting a more diverse police force, a huge challenge, especially after Ferguson. Use of force. What are the rules around the use of force, and how are officers trained in what to do? Body cameras. We had body cameras. We introduced them just a year earlier because we thought it would improve accountability, but in this case, the body camera wasn't on. Actually did more harm than good when people were asking, why is it not activated? So we invited the community to weigh in on how the procedures around body cameras could be better. And that process is ongoing, even now, building on other processes we've been undertaking for years. And the biggest thing we've learned is that all of this is connected, that we cannot separate the experience of systematic disempowerment, for example, economic disempowerment, from the experiences people have with policing and the criminal justice system, especially when the entire criminal justice system is serving up injustice. It's one of the reasons why I've come to believe that we must end not only mandatory minimums in so many of the cases that we're seeing on the federal side, but end incarceration as a response to drug possession, because we've seen how much inequity there is leading to cases of incarceration that do more harm than the original offense that it's supposed to respond to. So this is part of a bigger system, obviously. But we've got to tackle this head on. And the other thing I learned, the tough lesson that I've learned, is that not everybody's ready for this conversation. That, in particular, this conversation has to happen among white Americans coming to terms with what whiteness is. And the thing about being white is you're not reminded of your race all the time. And when I, for example, spoke to our police officers in the wake of that shooting and talked about systemic racism, just the mention of the word systemic racism made them feel like their character was under attack. When actually part of what I was telling them is that this problem doesn't get solved without them working to solve it too. So as a candidate, I'm committed to having these conversations, not just when talking to black audiences or trying to convince black voters to support me, but having these conversations with white audiences and with national audiences too, because we have seen the hard way in my community how the entire community is harmed by walls of mistrust that have gone up because of systemic racism. And while no one suffers more from it than those who are discriminated against, the entire community, and by extension the entire country, suffers until we successfully dismantle these walls in our time.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will now take a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Trone Garriott.
Last night at the Liberty and Justice event, you spoke of an America defined by, not by exclusion, but by belonging. And that takes intentional work and a seat at the table. Give examples of how you have engaged people of color in your campaign leadership, and what is your vision for increasing leadership of people of color in your administration and across government?
Thank you. So I think that gets to the reality that personnel is policy. Who is at the table matters an awful lot for the kinds of decisions that will be made. And the reason that we are proud to have a diverse campaign staff is not only that it reflects our values, belonging being one of the core values of this campaign, but also because we make better decisions. It makes us a better campaign. When you have more diverse leadership, whether we're talking about race or gender or experience, you wind up being a more successful organization. So our campaign, last time I checked, was around 40% people of color, including in senior leadership, from our senior advisor to our national investment chair. So many people who bring their experiences, our traveling press secretary who's with me just about every day on the road, some of the key people in our policy operation who are shaping this campaign to make sure that it lives out its values. This is going to be critically important for the federal government too, from appointees to the bench to the people in charge of our different agencies. Because we cannot do a good job leading America if we don't reflect America from the top. And again, my experience is that of having been empowered both by the activism of people like me and the support of people not like me. It's why I know that with my own background, it is doubly important for me to be surrounded by people who can speak personally to the experience of being a person of color in this country. It's why it's so important that I be among what needs to be a growing number of male feminists in this country. It is why we all need to be standing up for each other at the time.
Thank you. This time we'll offer you 1 minute for closing remarks.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion. And again, we're just touching things that we could speak volumes about. So I hope that this is an ongoing conversation. I hope you'll consult information that we have online or in other appearances. And I want to insist that all of us have to stand up for each other at a time like this, because the president has done a very good job of pitting us all against each other. That wall at the border isn't ever going to be built, but some very real walls have gone up within our families and within our communities. And this is a moment where anybody who has ever been on the wrong end of a pattern of exclusion in this country, which, by the way, turns out to be most of us in some way, shape, or form, has to stand up for each other, has to find in our own identity the sources of solidarity to reach out to others and to defend the rights of others as energetically as we do our own. And I believe that there is no more powerful space to do that than in the context of a presidential election. I'm determined not only to bring an end to this era we're surviving in right now, but to set up with you the next era that we could actually be proud of, that we could look back at 2020 and say to ourselves, I'm sorry it got as bad as it did by 2019, but look at what we did in 2020 to start making things right. That's what I'm seeking to do. That's what I'm asking you to be a part of. And that's why I'm so glad that there is the energy, the passion, the commitment, and the understanding that the people in this room represent. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.
Always a positive time that we have a deep discussion on that.
I'd love it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Mayor Pete.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
At this time, help me welcome to the stage former Secretary of HUD, Julian Castro.
Getting pretty excited about what's next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me. Hello, y'all. How are you?
Hello. How are you? Good morning.
Doing well.
Good afternoon. Is it afternoon?
Yeah.
Oh, good afternoon. Never mind.
Good afternoon. I have a couple of minutes.
3 minutes.
Yeah. All right, y'all. First of all, it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Cameron, Dizia, and Reku for moderating today, and of course want to thank everybody involved in the NAACP here in Des Moines and Iowa and across our country for the tremendous work that you continue to do to make sure that we can live up to the spirit of our founding documents, a nation where everybody is treated equally, and no matter who you are, that you can realize your dreams in this country. You know, during the course of this campaign, I have articulated a strong vision for an America where everyone counts. For a president who is not just focused on being a president for some, but being a president for all. A president who is not trying to divide us, but trying to bring us together as a country. And a president who doesn't want to make America anything again, who doesn't want to go backward, but wants to go forward and make America greater than it's ever been in the years to come. That's the kind of America that I want. And throughout this campaign, our campaign has been different from the other campaigns, not only in its vision, but also in the way that we've spoken up for the most vulnerable people in our country. I haven't been afraid to speak up for the victims of police brutality, to say their names, and not only that, to put out a plan for how we're going to make sure that no matter who you are, no matter the color of your skin, what neighborhood you're growing up in, how much money you have or don't have, you're treated the same by our criminal justice system, beginning with law enforcement. I haven't been afraid to go to Flint and to provide a plan on how we can make sure that lead is no longer a major public health threat, I haven't been afraid to go and speak to those who are hurting in our country, people who are homeless, folks living in storm drainage tunnels underneath the Las Vegas Strip. A woman that I mentioned yesterday named Arletta, who's living in a trailer park in Waukee, Iowa, and a few months ago got a letter telling her that her rent was going up by more than 60%, even though she's lived there for 40 years. We've been speaking up for the people that are often forgotten. Somewhere along the way in the Democratic Party in our country, we started to do real good talking about the middle class and fighting for them. I'm fighting for the middle class too. But we also forgot about the poor. We forgot about the most vulnerable. We forgot about those who need us the most and why we're Democrats in the first place. I haven't forgotten. My vision for this country is of a country where everyone does count. And we're going to make sure that that's the kind of America that we take back from Donald Trump in 2021. Thank you very much for having me.
Secretary, you say that you favor some form of reparations. Beyond a task force or an analysis, what would reparations look like in your administration, and where would the money come from?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I have said that. I believe that that part of the unfinished moral business of this nation is making good on repairing what was done through slavery and in the time after that, and that we do owe a moral debt to the descendants of those who were held as slaves. I also believe, and I've said clearly, that legally in this country, under our Constitution, if somebody takes your property, if the government takes your property, that's a taking, and that you're owed compensation. So why wouldn't we compensate people who were sanctioned as property by the state during that time? Your question is, what would that actually look like? Now, I support Sheila Jackson Lee's resolution to establish a task force, a commission that would be charged with bringing forward a recommendation. And I think people have different approaches on what it might look like. In my mind, there would be some connection between being a descendant of a slave and actually getting compensated, in addition to investments that we need to make that others have brought up in lifting education levels, lifting job opportunity levels, ensuring that we reform our criminal justice system so that more broadly we have justice and opportunity in this country. And so I see both of those as part of the way forward. I do think, though, that because probably the best thing that we can get out of this process would be the healing that can come forward through a process that has buy-in from people around the country. I think that the plan forward is better constructed by a group that comes together to make a recommendation to the president than from the mind of any one person, even if that is the president of the United States. And so I see value in the approach that Representative Jackson Lee has set forward if we're ever actually going to get to a plan that can include reparations.
Thank you.
Good morning. You told former Vice President Joe Biden that you are fulfilling former President Barack Obama's legacy. How so?
Well, I mean, my healthcare approach would include automatic enrollment of every single person in healthcare. And the Vice President's healthcare plan would leave 10 million people uninsured. I think all of us recognize that when the Affordable Care Act was passed a few years ago, that was a huge step forward. 7 presidents before Barack Obama had tried some form of universal health care coverage, and 7 presidents had failed. Barack Obama accomplished the closest thing that we've ever had to universal health care. And before Donald Trump and his administration started sabotaging the ACA, we got up to just over 90% of people insured, with a lot of popular provisions. The fact that a child can stay on to the age of 26, that these insurance companies, can't throw you off or deny you coverage because of so-called pre-existing conditions and so forth. Now we need to make sure that if we're going to go through the battle, remember what kind of a battle it was to get the Affordable Care Act in the first place, if we're going to go through another battle to get health care done, to improve it, then the number one priority, I think, and the vision that Barack Obama had for the future of health care is that every single person gets covered. That is the basis of my approach, to build our health care system off of Medicare and to make sure that if somebody wants it, that they can get it with a private option. In other words, you would automatically be part of that plan unless you opt out into a private health insurance plan. And if you have a private health insurance plan that you want to opt out into, there would be certain benchmarks that that private health insurance plan needs to meet. Because I actually think that Senator Warren and Senator Sanders make a very good point, which is there are a lot of private health insurance plans that when you actually start digging, when people get to the nuts and bolts and it's time to actually utilize that coverage, all of a sudden that coverage is not what people thought it was. And it doesn't support their needs. That means that if we do allow opting out into a private health insurance plan, it needs to have strong benchmarks for the coverage that it's going to offer. That's what I see, and what I'm trying to achieve is making sure that everybody has very strong coverage, but also fundamentally that they still have a choice, that folks do still have a choice if there's a strong health insurance plan that actually would live up to their needs when they need it.
Thank you. At this time, we'll have a question from the audience. I'd like to introduce you to Rachel Foster.
Hello. Right now in our country, particularly in red states, race and the degree to which racism exists has become a contentious political issue. If elected president, what steps will you take to not only ensure equality for all Americans, but also to make it help our friends on the other side of the aisle understand the ubiquity of racism and help us overcome it?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rachel, for the question. You know, my mom, probably the biggest reason that I'm in politics right now is because of my mother. My mom was an old Chicana activist, Mexican-American civil rights activist in the late 1960s and early 70s. And my brother Joaquin and I grew up in this household that was always very active about aspirations and ideals for the country. And one of those ideals, I think, no matter what the color of your skin or where you come from, or really your political beliefs, because I think there are a lot of people who are conservative, who are Republican, who share this aspiration, is that we can become a nation where it truly doesn't matter the color of your skin. It depends, as MLK said, on the content of your character and your hard work to succeed in this country. The saddest thing about this president, about President Trump, is that we are getting better as generations went by. The young people are getting better and better in terms of not seeing or not hating, not putting others down, not seeing others as the other, right? Appreciating differences. And this guy has come along, and it's not like we haven't had some of that before, but I mean in the youngest generation, he's radicalizing the youngest generation to go backward. That is sad. And so the next president is going to be charged not only with healing the nation from the tremendous division of this president, but also trying to move us forward. Let me say that begins by electing a candidate that can actually draw support and appeal to the African American community, right? We lost Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania last time. The African American vote fell from 66% to 59.5%. You think about cities like Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit, that are so important to winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. We need to elect a candidate that can speak to and excite the coalition of people that Barack Obama excited in 2008 and then take that to the next level. I can do that, and I'm running a campaign that has one of the most diverse staffs, including in leadership positions, and so we're living that out right now in the campaign. I have a track record when I was mayor of San Antonio and when I was HUD secretary of inclusion and of working to make sure that the African American community and other communities of color could also prosper. From when I was mayor and began right away focusing on the east side of San Antonio, that was the traditionally black part of the city, because I recognized that it had been long neglected, and we had great success in trying to invest in the east side for the benefit of people who live there. As housing secretary, putting forward the most significant rule called affirmatively furthering fair housing to further desegregate the United States and offer housing opportunity to people of color. And if I were elected president, what I would do is have an administration that looks like our country and that also makes important investments in education, in housing opportunity, in anti-discrimination enforcement across the board to make sure that no matter who you are, that you can prosper, and to do that in a way that invites all of us, whatever our skin color or our background, to be a part of it. Because I fundamentally believe that no matter who you are, that most people have a good heart for moving in that direction as a country. I don't buy Donald Trump's vision of America, that people have a dark heart, that they want to hate, that they want to see those folks as the other. I actually believe that people are open, that they're willing to make our nation better. And as president, I would lead that way, and I would make the investments so that we can truly close those gaps. And I know how important that is. I grew up in neighborhoods that were segregated. I went to public schools that were segregated. And I'm never going to forget where I came from and never forget doing the work so that everybody can have the kind of opportunities that I had in this country, no matter the color of their skin.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Castro. As a former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, we might expect you to have a housing plan, and indeed you do. Please tell us how your current People First housing plan would allow more access to affordable housing for minorities.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have right now a rental affordability crisis in this country. I bet y'all see here in Des Moines, those of y'all that may be from other places, it's not just these usual suspect cities like San Francisco or New York or Chicago. It's also places like Des Moines. It's my hometown of San Antonio. So here's what I would do. I would work on the supply side and also the demand side for housing. I have a housing plan that would invest so that we create 3 million more units of housing that is affordable to the middle class, the working poor, and the poor over the next 10 years by expanding the low-income housing tax credit, by investing in low-income, or the National Housing Trust Fund, community development block grants, home funding, and by working with the private sector to ensure that we have good land use regulations that allow for developing affordable housing. On top of that, I would do several things that we need to do to make sure that there's more housing opportunity. Enforce our anti-discrimination laws. Go back to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that we did in the Obama administration, that the Trump administration put on ice as soon as they took over. I would create an entitlement program off of the Housing Choice Voucher Program so that if you make less than 50% of the area median income in your area, you could get a Housing Choice Voucher, right, and go into the private market. And you still need to pay some of your income toward the rent, but it allows you to be able to afford that rent. And y'all know how as homeowners, right now our tax code rewards homeowners with a mortgage interest deduction. I think we need one for renters. And so I create a renter's refundable tax credit so that renters can afford the rent as it's going through the roof, so to speak. And those are the types of things that we would do to expand housing opportunity throughout our country.
Thank you.
Thank you. This time, I'd like to offer you 1 minute for closing remarks.
Well, thank you all again for having me here. Thank you to everybody for being here. In this election, we face a choice of the path that we're going to take in the years to come. My campaign is about the America that we can become. On America where everyone counts. On America where we don't forget the least among us, those who have the least. On America that works to become smarter and healthier and fairer and more prosperous for everyone. And I believe that voters are looking for 3 things in 2020. Somebody who has the right experience, the right vision, and somebody who can beat Donald Trump. I've been mayor of the 7th largest city in our country with a good track record with the African American community and communities of color. I've been Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, managing a $48 billion budget and offices across the country, 8,000 employees. I have a strong vision for the future of our country that I hope you'll check out at juliancastro.com. And I can beat Donald Trump. I can go and excite that Obama coalition from 10 years ago and then take that to the next level and not only win in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, but also go get those 29 electoral votes of Florida, the 11 electoral votes of Arizona, and the 38 electoral votes of my home state of Texas, and win and defeat Donald Trump and tell him adios on January 20th, 2021. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. We're down to our last speaker of the day. At this time, I would like you all to help me welcome to the stage Mr. Tom Steyer.
Hey, Cameron.
How you doing? Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. My pleasure. Hey, you guys.
Good morning. Welcome. Nice to see you. Good morning.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Great.
This time, we'll give you the opportunity for 3 minutes for opening statement.
Okay. Look, I'm running for president for a simple reason, which is I think that corporations have bought the government stopped working for people, and that we need to take it back. But I also know that when you look at inequality in the United States of America, it's impossible to look at it and not talk specifically about race. So let me go through 5 areas that I've thought about. I'm anxious to get to questions, but I want to make sure I cover 5 areas. One is enabling success. My wife and I started a community bank 12 years ago to basically stand up for economic justice, environmental sustainability, and support businesses owned by women and people of color. I believe that actually enabling ownership and success in low-income communities and communities of color is something that's absolutely critical. And as president, I would continue that work. That bank started at 0. It's over $1 billion. Housing. The other thing I know about inequality is that there's no way to think about inequality without realizing that housing is at the center of it. It's at the center of so much of the impact on people's lives. It is also the main way that Americans build wealth. And what we also know in terms of housing is there's too little affordable housing, and that banks traditionally have not been willing to lend in African American and Latino communities so people could own their own houses and get into that wealth generation that most Americans are able to. I want to make sure people realize I'm someone who really cares about climate, who really cares about pollution, and everything I've done over the last 10 years and everything I always will do having to do with clean energy, climate, and pollution will start with environmental justice, with the communities where this society has chosen to focus its air pollution and its bad water to the disadvantage of low-income communities and communities of color. I really care about climate, but the only way to get to a just solution is to make sure you have not just participation, but leadership in terms of policy from the start and execution going forward. Living wage. There has been a 40-year attack on working people in this country. You can see it in terms of how we've split up the money. It is absolutely unfair, and to me, it is the proof that these corporations have not just tried to buy the government, they've succeeded in buying the government, and they've done it to the disadvantage of working people. We're not just talking about 30 or 40% of people, we're talking 80 to 90% of Americans haven't had a raise for 2 generations. It's completely unfair. We have to address it directly. And the last thing I want to say is this. It's impossible to talk about economic sustainability and justice without talking about the criminal justice system itself. It's very unjust. I just came from a forum at the Eastern State Penitentiary. My mom used to teach reading at the Brooklyn House of Detention. How this criminal justice system has been used in a racist fashion over the last 40 years is something that we have to come to grips with and deal with people, formerly incarcerated people, in a fair way. I've worked at this at home in California. We've passed the end of cash bail. We've passed the end of automatic sentence enhancements. We have worked through this very specifically. I worked in Florida on the initiative to make sure that previously incarcerated people got back their voting rights as citizens. So this is something I feel is a critical part. If you want to talk about economic sustainability and justice, you've got to also be talking about criminal justice and treating formerly incarcerated people fairly and treating them as a protected class who cannot be discriminated against. I've also worked, again, in California, which passed something to end private prisons and something to end discrimination in using Section 8 vouchers. So,
Good morning.
good morning.
You are a billionaire. How do you relate to people in this room, and can minorities trust another rich white man in the Oval Office?
So let me say this. I have spent the last 7 years full-time traveling around the United States of America. I've taken the giving pledge to give away the bulk of my money while I'm alive. When it comes to matters of justice, this is something which, if you want to understand what it means to be you have to actually go to people and understand where they are. My mom worked her entire life really on a justice issue. And if you look at the United States, we came from a place of severe injustice. In fact, the success of the United States is not where we started. It's been the move to improve from where we started. And so if you look at what I've worked on for the last 10 years, if you look at who I work with, if you look at the values that I'm talking about and not just what I'm promising to do, but what I've successfully done, whether it's the bank or the initiatives that I've worked on that have passed, I can say this: I have a body of work that says justice is at the core of anything that I have done and will do. And I give you my word that this is something where, in the United States of America, undoing injustice and moving towards justice, specifically with regard to race, is something that I think will be a measure of whether I succeed or fail, whether my administration succeeds or fail, and whether this country succeeds or fail.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we'll have a question from our audience. I'd like to introduce you to Keisha Duke.
Keisha?
Yes. Is it Keisha or Keisha? Keisha. Keisha, sorry.
It's okay, it happens. So a recent report found in the Midwest is one of the worst places for Black people to live, pointing to racial disparities in education, employment, income, poverty, homeownership, incarceration, access to healthcare, and voting access. What specific policies will you implement to make the Midwest a better place for Black residents?
Okay, so Keisha.
Yeah.
That was a lot of different specific areas.
Yeah.
What I believe and what I have found is that in every single area of policy in the United States, of domestic policy, there is an element of residual racism. And we have to talk about it, we have to call it out, and then we have to specifically address it. So that, I mean, just as an example, in terms of education, the way that we as a society pay for public schools tends to be on a local basis based on property taxes, which means that if you're growing up in a community that's a low-income community and therefore has low property taxes, there are fewer dollars for your education, which means that we're in effect legislating inequality going forward in terms of giving people educational opportunities and the ability to live up to their capabilities. As president, I would do everything I could to actually use federal dollars to take care of that, to even things out so that people from low-income communities, specifically African-American communities, would not be at that disadvantage. When you think about housing and wealth for a second, my point was, if in the old days, I was at a church in Ohio last month, and they had an exhibit. It was in Cleveland, Ohio, showing what banks did to literally draw red lines on the map of Cleveland with the African-American communities and say, you cannot lend in these areas. What we need to do as a society, what my bank has specifically done, and what I would do as president, is go to the red-lined areas and make them green-lined areas. What the bank has done is gone there specifically to lend money, to provide capital to people who couldn't get capital. So that's for businesses, that's for low-income housing, that's for mortgages, that's basically to try and redress previously unfair things. If you look at what's gone on in terms of criminal justice, you know, criminal justice is not one thing. It starts with policing. It starts with how we interact between communities and police. We know that there has been racial injustice in the way that communities are policed. So the response to that starts with training and sensitivity. It moves to, we need more community policing in those areas. And lastly, the federal government needs to provide oversight to make sure that in places where there is injustice, that the Justice Department goes and roots it out and punishes it. But in case, so what I want to make one last point. Look, in every one of these areas, you can't think about it without thinking about race and talking about it. And I know it's uncomfortable for people in the United States, but I believe we need to have this conversation formally and openly in the United States to go back and discover what happened, what it means now, and the solutions that we're going to come up with area by area, specifically going forward, without shying away from the fact that there has been formal, legalized racism in this country for 400 years. Is that okay? You're in high school right now?
College.
Where you go to college? Very nice to meet you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Steyer.
Call me Tom.
Call you Tom. Tom.
Please.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. A big focus of your campaign has been climate change, and as you alluded to earlier, that can have a tremendous impact, especially on communities of color. What can be done? What would you do to protect those communities as the climate continues to degrade, and also protect them from pollution, where, as we know, too much dumping of all kinds of crap goes on?
So, Reka, I've been working on this, on climate, for more than a decade. And let's start with a couple of points about who's an environmentalist in the United States of America. If you break down who cares about clean energy, pollution, climate, the environment, by ethnicity and race, the #1 group of people in the United States who care about that are Latinos. The #2 group that cares about that is African Americans. And the #3 group that cares about that is Asian Americans. So let's talk about what it means and why that's important. We also know, and I know this in my home state of California, and I know this from every place I've gone, if you want to find bad, dangerous air that causes kids to have asthma and not able to go to school and not able to go out and play and be sick for their whole lives, go to a low-income community or black and brown community. If you want to find the places where people get sick from the water, I mean, let's talk Flint, Newark, the Valley in California, and I went to a place called Denmark, South Carolina, rural, low-income, African-American community where people were getting sick because they would not get them a water treatment facility, and so people were getting sick and risking death. When I talk about climate, one of the things, our climate plan, and look, this is my #1 priority, is called a justice-based climate plan, because we're going to start with the people from those places to make sure that when we solve climate, we're cleaning up the air, we're making sure that we have clean water as a right for every single American citizen, but specifically the people in those areas. We want leadership in policy and execution from those communities, and that the millions of good-paying union jobs we create disproportionately help low-income communities and communities of color. So we want to use our plan to, we have a huge problem that we need to address. We can address it, and we can get huge benefits from it, but we specifically want to make sure that it addresses both pollution and income problems in low-income communities and communities of color. And by the way, that is where the leadership in California has come from. When we reauthorized the most aggressive climate laws in the world, we did it with leadership from people in the poorest zip codes, leadership from people in the poorest zip codes in California, and that bill took the money from our carbon cap and trade system and gave it disproportionately to those communities to make up for the decades of concentrating pollution in those communities and making people sick and die. That is what I believe in.
Thank you. 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 Thank you.
As you know, the NAACP was heavily involved in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Over the past several years, we have witnessed a dismantling of that act through legislation which was backed up by the Supreme Court. In your opinion, what needs to be fixed to the current Voting Rights Act?
Look, the Supreme Court basically said that voting rights had been accomplished, and now we didn't need oversight from the federal government to make sure that states weren't violating the civil rights, specifically of African Americans. And what we've seen is a concerted, organized effort to take away the voting rights of African Americans subsequent to that. I mean, it's not funny. You know, if in every Republican-dominated state, a state where they have a Republican governor, Republican state senate, Republican state legislature, we see an attempt to take away the voting rights, first of all, of African Americans, and secondly, of young people. I started one of the largest grassroots organizations in the United States, NextGen. We specifically are focused on young people, which is the largest generation in American history. It's also the most diverse generation in American history, and part of it is specifically called Black Lives Rising, to make sure we're focused on African American youth, to make sure that they're registered, engaged, and voting. To me, this goes to the heart. I was saying, we started, look, the Constitution includes a lot of things that we're incredibly ashamed of now, but we've moved away from it. The idea that there is organized, intentional restriction of voting, suppression of voting of African Americans specifically, seems to me to fly in the face of everything that is most American. That our deepest values, what people have done to get those voting rights. I mean, let's remember what it cost to actually get that law in place. So to me, pushing back on that from the standpoint of the Justice Department is something that I would do. I view that as a criminal act. I really do. People getting in a room and plotting to take away the basic citizenship right based on race, that's a criminal act to me. And I would definitely put the Justice Department on it. Look, this flies. I believe, look, I've spent 10 years trying to broaden the democracy to get people registered. NextGen has registered over 1.5 million people. We're focused on young people and communities of color so that we get a representative democracy. The idea that people are doing the exact opposite, that they're plotting secretly in a room to do the opposite, to me, flies in the face of my deepest values. And I would do anything I could to push back, including using the Justice Department on a criminal basis.
Thank you. With that, we'd like to offer you 1 minute for a closing remark.
So look, I think that the reason Donald Trump got elected was because we don't know what it means to be an American anymore. That basically there was a huge vacuum in terms of what the country stands for, how we relate to each other, the rights of Americans in the 21st century, and what we're trying to accomplish together. And we're talking here about the most basic ideas of justice. And if this isn't a critical part of what we see as success, if this isn't a critical part of what we see in terms of how we, not the way Mr. Trump is vilifying people by race and ethnicity and national origin and sexual orientation and gender, if we don't see our progress in terms of accepting people as full human beings and full citizens as a critical measurement of who we are, what we stand for, and our success, then we have blown it completely. And when we think about, I always say to people, look, if you think about a kid in Compton, California, getting a good education where we're investing in that kid, and he or she gets a good education and becomes a productive member of society and a good citizen, if you don't think that helps people in Des Moines, then you don't understand what it is to be an American. And similarly, if there's a kid in Des Moines and we invest in them and support them and do everything we can to make them successful in the 21st century, if you don't understand that's great for the people in San Francisco and Miami and Maine, then you don't understand what's going on. The way that we're going to succeed as a country is not to give money to a bunch of rich people. It's for the vast bulk of Americans to succeed together and to understand we're going to invest in each other. That's the best investment we're ever going to make. We're going to succeed together, and we're going to be incredibly proud about what that stands for, and that is going to be the meaning of America again. So when you talk about separation and division and vilification, and the idea of taking away people's voting rights based on race, and refusing people's rights who were previously incarcerated, that goes to the very heart of what we should not be doing in the 21st century. So I look at this as the very heart of success going forward, and we have to turn the page on these people. We need a big win, but we need to turn the page and just say, these ideas, we always knew they were noxious. We need everybody to show up so we can say, and the vast bulk of Americans know it. That's what this election is going to be about to a very large extent. That's what I really think.
Thank you all. With that includes our evening, but I have a few thank yous. First, to my amazing co-moderators, Reka Masu and TC Muzinga. They do this on a daily basis.
Thank you.
Bringing you guys the stories that matter. And I just allow you to you guys gave me grace to pretend for a day to be a moderator. So, in addition to that, I want to thank the entire NAACP, our membership, but in particularly our Political Action Committee, which is chaired by Heather Jones. It's right over here. Our Economic Development Committee, which is chaired by Matt Gilbert, who was here. There he goes. Matt, don't clap for yourself. Raise your hand. In addition to that, I want to thank the Drake College chapter, which was just chartered this year. I want to thank our Des Moines Youth Council for volunteering with us and all the volunteers. I want to thank Drake University for hosting us not only today, but they also hosted our first annual economic summit yesterday, where we had over 125 students and young professionals who attended that. Quick announcements. This upcoming week, the NAACP is hosting its annual job fair on Thursday, November 7th at Corinthian Baptist Church from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. If you or your friends are either unemployed or underemployed, this is a great opportunity. We have over 25 vendors that will be hosting that evening. In addition to that, on November 9th, we'll be hosting our annual Freedom Fund banquet at the Ron Pearson Center in West Des Moines at 6 p.m. This is the only time of year that we actually do a fundraiser, and these funds help us do our work throughout the entire year. The NAACP has 5 game-changer areas that we focus on. That's education, criminal justice, health, economic sustainability, and voter engagement. 2 of those you witnessed today. Economic sustainability will remain a key priority for us throughout the coming year, and voter engagement is always important because no matter what the issue, at the end of the day, it comes down to our vote. So I do want to remind you, lastly, that on Tuesday, November 5th, we have a vote here in Des Moines in the metro area for city council and for school board. These guys have some time, but we don't have time to wait to figure out who's going to be our leadership here locally. So on November 5, bring 5 friends to the poll. Thank you, guys.